Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Studierende, willkommen zur 10. Ausgabe unserer Jahrestagung des Masterstudienganges Sammlung Provenienz Kulturelles Erbe, alias SPKE. Wir haben auch diesmal wieder aktuelle Beiträge zu den 3 Themenbereichen unseres Würzburger Studienganges versammelt. Ein Studiengang, der die Vermittlung fachlicher Kompetenzen in der Provenienzrecherche mit einer Einführung in die Sammlungsforschung und einem Ausblick auf Konzepte und Konstruktionen des kulturellen Erbes verbindet. Trotz der überaus begrenzten finanziellen Ausstattung hat der Studiengang in den Jahren seines Bestehens viele tolle Absolventinnen und Absolventen hervorgebracht und damit auch so manche interessante Abschlussarbeit. Also das zum Lobe des Studiengangs. Anders als in den früheren Jahren sind die Referate der Jahrestagung heute und morgen nicht streng nach den 3 Themenbereichen getrennt, sondern bieten einen bunten methodischen Strauß aus Referaten zu unterschiedlichen Arbeitssituationen, zur Sammlungserschließung, Sammlungspräsentation, unter anderem Universitätssammlungen und Objektbiografien. Dazu kommen Bestandsaufnahmen zur Provenienzforschung, zu ihren Institutionen und ihrem rechtlichen Rahmen. Und dann eben das Kulturerbe. Hier liegt ein deutlicher Akzent auf dem Umgang mit Hinterlassenschaften der NS-Zeit. Auch, wie ich sehe, Aspekte des Digitalen haben einen gewissen Anteil. Bevor ich jetzt gleich schon das Mikrofon weitergebe, möchte ich vorab bereits den Organisatorinnen Daniela Roberts und Susanne Müller-Bechtel danken, dazu allen Helfern und Moderatoren und natürlich den beiden Mitstudiengangsverantwortlichen, nämlich Anuschka Tischer und Guido Fackler. Ein besonderer Dank selbstverständlich auch jetzt schon an die Medientechnik von André Mischke und Raphael Bücken. Wir haben, wie auch in den letzten Jahren, wieder einen Chat. Das heißt, wir haben eine Studentin, die sich freundlicherweise bereit erklärt hat, diesen Chat zu übernehmen. Sie können also an die Vortragenden Fragen stellen. So, das ist von meiner Seite jetzt schon alles. Ich wünsche uns eine interessante, auch kurzweilige Jahrestagung. Vielen Dank.
Ja, auch von mir ein ganz herzliches Willkommen zu unserer diesjährigen Jahrestagung. Mein Name ist Daniela Roberts und ich führe Sie durch unsere heutige Sektion, also die etwa bis 7 Uhr vermutlich dauern wird. Wir sind ein bisschen im Verzug, aber ich denke, das wird schon ganz in Ordnung gehen. Ich möchte dann auch gleich unseren ersten Rednerinnen vorstellen. Unsere ersten 3 Rednerinnen werden in Englisch vortragen und aus diesem Grunde werde ich auch auf Englisch die Vorstellung machen. Welcome, Vivian Nielsen. I would like to introduce you. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the New Carlsberg Glyptothek and the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen. She holds a research fellowship at the Linacre College, University of Oxford, where she is also affiliated as associate researcher at the Pitt Rivers Museum and academic visitor at the Department of the History of Art. She defended her PhD in anthropology at the University of Copenhagen in 2019 and was recently appointed member of the Young Academy at the Royal Danish Academy of Science and Letters. Her research on the colonial legacy of museums has been published in leading international journals and anthologies. Later this year, her monograph, Palms and Prestige, Reproduction, the Tropics in the Glasshouses of Copenhagen, will be published with the New Carlsberg Glyptothek and Aarhus University Press. We welcome you. We're happy that we have you here. And today she talks to Curating Botany, Colonial Legacies and Contemporary Responses.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this wonderful introduction. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes?
We can hear you.
Good. All right.
Perfect.
I will just share my screen and find my PowerPoint. Does that go through where you are?
Yes, lovely.
Great. Thank you very much. So, although the involvement of botanical gardens in the colonial expansion of especially the British Empire is well documented, the public communication of this part of the history of botanical gardens is often not as visible as it has been increasingly become in many ethnographic museums, where the topic has been dealt with more actively within recent years. In this talk, presenting findings from my ethnographic fieldwork conducted in the botanical gardens of Oxford and Kew, I show how the colonial legacies of the plant collections of the two British gardens are often only superficially communicated to their visitors, despite numerous initiatives taking place behind the scenes. Applying examples from my fieldwork in the Huntington Botanical Gardens on the outskirts of Los Angeles, the talk will further present ways in which indigenous names and uses of plants can be integrated in their public presentation through inclusions of their common names in different languages. The talk will finally provide examples from my most recent research on how the bourgeois fascination of plants from the tropics and the ways in which they were presented in elaborate glasshouses around the turn of the 19th century are heavily rooted in European colonialism. The Oxford Botanic Garden is the oldest of its kind in the United Kingdom. Since 1621, it has been located along the banks of the Cherwell River, across the road from Magdalen College. Like the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, founded in 1759, the Oxford Botanic Garden thus predates the time during which the British Empire was the largest the world has ever seen. Despite their age and the fact that the colonial era significantly transformed the specific organizational forms and roles of both gardens, their imperial legacies are not made immediately visible to their visitors. However, as I will demonstrate in this talk, both gardens not only have deep roots in colonialism, they also to some extent reproduce colonial era worldviews in their written and oral communication by celebrating discoveries made by European botanists, plant scientists, and colonial explorers, who still to this day are often admirably described as people who helped discover and introduce exotic plants from many parts of the world. By questioning the use of words like discoveries in situations where plants were most likely already known and used by indigenous communities, my articles, The Colonial Roots of Botany, Legacies of Empire in the Botanic Gardens of Oxford and Kew from 2023, and public presentations of plants, colonial legacies, and indigenous perspectives in the Botanical Gardens of the Huntington from 2025, contribute to the literature on botanical gardens with a critical approach to the many writings celebrating European naturalists and plant scientists as explorers discovering the world. My articles provide a unique fieldwork-based perspective on how the colonial legacies of botanical gardens are communicated to visitors in some of the most prominent and influential botanical gardens in the United Kingdom and the United States. They thus shed light on a part of the museum sector, which generally speaking tends to focus more on loss of biodiversity than on the impact of colonialism. However, as I will demonstrate in the following, communicating the consequences of colonial exploitation need not stand in contrast with the important initiatives made by botanical gardens to widen public understandings of the impact of climate change. Although the involvement of botanical gardens in the colonial expansion of European empires is undeniable, a decolonial gardens, nor in the text panels communicating the cultural history of their plants to the public. Meta-level stories about how the plants ended up in their current locations and why they, or the seeds from which they originate, were brought to the shores of England and the outskirts of Los Angeles, were not immediately present. Nor was the local knowledge from indigenous peoples, which in many cases was neither recognized nor recorded, in the process of systematizing the flora and fauna of the world into one European-founded Latin system. Through my research on how the cultural history of the plants is communicated to the visiting public, I seek to highlight that it is not only the collections of ethnographic or cultural historical museums which have deep roots in colonial era collection practices. So too have the biological parts of the museum world, the ones which are found growing in botanical gardens and under domes of glass far from their areas of origin. Here, the worldviews of colonial times are also evident, partly through name-giving traditions and classification methods of species new to science, but also with regard to the lack of visibility of local knowledge from indigenous populations, which in many cases were not documented at the time of collection. At a time when imperial mindsets are yet again dominating world politics, and recent calls for decolonization within and from outside museum institutions are challenged, discussions about how and where stories about objects collected by museums and botanical gardens during colonial times are best conveyed are at the forefront of many a debate within the museum world, especially within ethnographic museums, where the repatriation or return of objects is a topic full of political tension. But what about botanical gardens? Although discussions about repatriation of plants are mostly had in relation to access to digitalized archives and herbaria, classifications of collections in botanical gardens are also a result of the time and context in which the objects, or in this case, plants, were collected. The ways in which collections of any kind are presented to the public reveals a great deal about the underlying structures of society, which often unnoticed determines how an object or plant is described. Or, as Kew Gardens itself puts it in its History, Equity and Inclusion Action Plan, what Kew Gardens itself puts in its History, Equity and Inclusion, what Kew chooses to say or not to say reflects what it is as an institution today. The volunteer guide leading the tour of Kew Gardens that I attended in 2022 enthusiastically opened her arms as she welcomed the group of visitors that I was part of to the south wing of the Temperate House from 1862. "Welcome to Africa," she said, explaining that here visitors can experience examples of plants from the temperate zones of the African continent. Further on, the tour guide took us past plant compositions from other parts of the world, spread over 5 continents and 16 islands. Section after section, we passed through small pieces of representations of the temperate parts of the planet, all gathered under one iconic roof in what Kew Gardens itself refers to as its glittering cathedral. The construction of the Temperate House complemented the Victorian Palm House, which in 1844 was constructed to combine the latest in glass and iron manufacturing techniques to create a building of unprecedented lightness and grace. Together, the two greenhouses provide a unique opportunity for British and international visitors to the garden to experience unusual plants collected from tropical and temperate regions around the world without ever having to venture further away than the outskirts of London. Without ever even boarding a ship, the public could experience the damp heat and lush vegetation of the colonies. In recreating the tropics on the banks of the Thames, the Palm House declared technology's victory over nature. But the two greenhouses not only illustrated the victory over technology over nature, the vastness of the collection of plants also demonstrated Britain's imperial power by presenting a microcosm that illustrated how far and wide the British Empire stretched across the globe. Through the taming of the colonized world, whose wealth of plants are now housed in Kew, the colonial exercise of power was demonstrated to the visitors of the gardens. This demonstration was not significantly different from the ways museums, such as the British Museum, presented and to some extent still presents objects collected from all over the world in a cementation of London as the capital of the empire and centre of the world. Like its cultural historic cousin, which still to this day proudly presents itself as a museum of the world for the world, Kew Gardens often rather uncritically prides itself of being an obvious centerpiece representing its outstanding collection of globally acquired plants to its visitors. The guided tour around Kew ended with a plant presented as a bit of a sensation, the Wollemi pine tree, Wollemia nobilis, from the temperate rainforest area of the Wollemi National Park in New South Wales in southeastern Australia. It is estimated that less than 100 examples of the tree exist in the wild, although it is now common in public gardens around the United Kingdom. With a certain element of pride in being able to show a living example of this critically endangered tree at Kew, the tour guide enthusiastically told the story behind the unique find, which is also described on the sign planted in front of the tree. Next to the description of the so-called living fossil is a picture of the tree in a visibly younger version, accompanied by a smiling man. The caption below the photo explains that it is the English-born Australian botanist David Noble who discovered the Wollemi pine standing next to one of the specimens planted near Kew's temperate house. As so often before, the newly so-called discovered species was named after the white man of European descent who had supposedly found it. Where is the story of the indigenous people who lived in this place for millennia and most likely knew about the tree long before Noble, who is credited with discovering it and even got the species named after him? In the Oxford Botanic Garden, the written dissemination of a selection of recognizable plants in the collection has in recent years been supplemented by cultural historical text panels based on Stephen Harris's book, What Have Plants Ever Done For Us? The text panels communicate information about plant-based products that most people are familiar with in their everyday lives, but do not necessarily associate with the plants they come from. Through the text panels, visitors can now closely study what the plants that bear the fruits of the coffee bush or cocoa tree and the leaves of the tobacco plant look like, and in addition get information about the cultural historical origins of the plants. But although the cultural history of many of the plants on display is closely associated with Britain's past as a world-spanning colonial empire, this is only superficially acknowledged in the text panels of the garden. An example of the lack of attention to this part of the history is the sign by the entrance to the glasshouse collections that presents the story of how seeds and plant specimens, which ended up contributing to the financial success of the British Empire, were transported back to Britain. Under the headline, Plants That Changed the World and How They Were Moved, the story about how an unspecified we invented baskets, boxes, and barrels to protect seeds and seedlings from their arduous journeys across continents is told. Visitors are informed that the transportation solutions were not very efficient, so it was not until the 1820s, with the invention of the Wardian case, a transportable miniature greenhouse, that the efficient transport of plants across the planet became possible. Further down, the text informs visitors to the garden that when first the unspecified we understood the needs of the plants, it became possible to control the temperature, light, water, and nutrition. Nowhere is it mentioned that the many seeds and seedlings that were brought to Britain on arduous journeys were brought back as part of a larger colonial investment in plants with economic potential. Nor are the less glorious aspects of the sophisticated palaces of iron and glass, which, as previously described, were not only built to protect and cultivate plants, but also to cement the imperial status of Britain. The use of an unspecified we might create an element of connection between the contemporary reader of the text panel and the historic roots of the botanical garden by establishing a link between the botanists, doctors, tradesmen, and officers who ventured out to discover the world and collect seeds and specimens from unknown shores, and the visitor who reads the text panel today. But are all visitors to the botanical garden included in this unspecified we? What if one's family's roots origin in one of the places that were so-called discovered and colonized by the British or other European colonial powers? In its attempt to construct a connection between then and now, the text thus creates an unnecessary distinction between an us and an them, a world at home and a world beyond. It is thought-provoking that the cultural historical dissemination of plants in the Oxford Botanic Garden does not to the same extent as the dissemination of objects in other museum collections in the universities, gardens, libraries, and museums network consider the human consequences of colonial collections. The collection, naming, and redistribution of, in this case, seeds and plants, initiated by the Botanical Gardens of Oxford and Kew, in direct extension of the colonial power apparatus of the British Empire, is not significantly different from the collection of the artworks and cultural artifacts that were acquired by Europe's colonial powers and subsequently exhibited in museums across Europe, based on a notion that other people's material cultural heritage could exhibit Europeans as more developed and civilized than others. The difference is perhaps simply that the decolonial discourses that in recent years have gained more ground in museums with art and cultural historical or ethnographic objects have not gained the same degree of popularity among curators and botanical researchers who manage the public dissemination of botanical gardens. Presumably, based on the notion that visitors to botanical gardens are not as interested as visitors to art and cultural history museums in this part of history, but prefer a potentially less conflict-filled history, evolving around the medicinal and nutritional properties, as well as the aesthetic qualities of plants. Similar concerns about ensuring that visitors should have a nice day out rather than be too directly confronted by issues of colonialism or climate change were raised at the Huntington Botanical Gardens in Los Angeles, where I conducted fieldwork in 2024. Although the Huntington was only founded in 1919 and did not open its doors to the public before 1928, the collections of plants presented there are closely related to the long history associated with the vast global trade in plants, which picked up significantly as European powers established colonies around the world. When I first visited the Huntington in 2024, it quickly transpired that colonial legacies in the shape of Eurocentric garden displays and descriptions of plants that leave little room for their stories' pre-European discovery remain present in the ways in which the plants of the botanical gardens are presented to the public. The original focus of the art collections of the Huntington on British and European art also shines through in the botanical gardens, which were initially established in 1903 by the German-born landscape architect William Hertwig, with an eye to European estates. Like their European counterparts, wealthy Americans of the late 19th and early 20th century built extravagant displays of palms and other exotic species in purpose-built glass houses on their estates, meant to simulate the tropics. As in most European estates of the era, rose gardens played a significant and central role, showcasing that even in dry areas like Southern California, the gardens of Europe could be recreated by those who had the means. However, as Yvette Saavedra has emphasized, there was a Southern California before the roses. It is nevertheless only very recently that the botanical gardens of the Huntington have actively sought to feature plants native to the dry climate of Southern California by establishing the Francis and Sidney Brody California Garden, which reflects the local Mediterranean climate as well as the agricultural and elegant history of the 207-acre Huntington grounds." End of quote. It is worth noticing how even the local climate is being described from a Eurocentric point of view on the website of the Huntington by referring to it as Mediterranean. Despite displaying plants native to the local area, hardly any attention is given in this part of the botanical gardens to acknowledge that the Huntington exists on the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples Gabrielino Tongva and Kish Nation, who continue to call the region home. However, In the recently opened semi-permanent exhibition Borderlands, artworks exhibited inside the Virginia Steele Scott Galleries of American Art are linked with the gardens outside through large windows, as well as an education room where visitors can learn about locally sourced botanical and mineral-based pigments. In front of the main venue of the exhibition, 3 large pots are presenting plants native to the area now known as California, with signs listing the names of the plants in up to 5 different languages, 1 to 3 indigenous names, as well as Spanish, English, and Latin. Similar signs are dotted around the gardens, advertising the Borderlands exhibition and showcasing the indigenous names and uses of the selected plants. One of the plants is the elderberry, which has its name listed in Tongva, Spanish, English, and Latin. It is described as follows. For thousands of years, this stunning California native plant has provided fruit and flowers for food, dye, and wood for a number of instruments and tools. It is thus recognized that the story and uses of the elderberry long predate the arrival of European settlers in North America. In conclusion, and with a little teaser to my latest research about glass houses in Copenhagen, the way the world is organized today is very much a result of past thought patterns and colonial perceptions of the world. As museums and other cultural institutions increasingly engage in public discussions about their colonial legacies, the public communication of botanical gardens and other plant collections could similarly benefit from a thorough examination of the wording applied in labels and on guided tours. As I have shown in this presentation, further efforts are being made to ensure that the written and oral communication of botanical gardens does not solely perpetuate colonial-era worldviews that present discoveries of newfound species. However, more attention could be given to the colonial legacies of plants in botanical gardens and in winter gardens, like this one seen here in the Ny Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, to emphasize that even gardens enjoyed by visitors as a nice day out are associated with colonial trade and Eurocentric depictions of the world. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. Yeah, I guess most active collections are in some way, have in some way a colonial legacy. But at the first sight, nature doesn't seem to be really that problem because the objects which are collected are not singular, but as you demonstrated, it's rather the perception or the narration which separates people really from their local tradition or knowledge. It's also the way we interpreted their natural heritage with the eyes of the West. Yeah, I thought that's quite, thoughtful. Yeah, so I'm wondering that, I'm pretty sure there must be some questions or comments to this. Still a little bit of hesitation, but do you have anything in the chat? Not yet. Yeah, I was wondering how much awareness. I mean, you had some examples where we can see the Huntington in Los Angeles, which starts to addressing the problem more. Or well, how about others? Do you have any experience with other botanical gardens so far?
Yeah, so I think it's important to stress that there are initiatives being at place in many botanical gardens. My critique in my article and in my presentation of these examples that I came with from Kew Gardens, for instance, luckily they don't stand alone. They are working hard to sort of uncover the colonial legacies of the institution and hosting conferences and having research projects done on this area. And, in time, I think this will definitely also reflect more in the ways that the stories are presented. So I think museums of all kinds, including Botanical Garden, have such an important role to play because they can initiate these conversations in the wider population. So one thing is what is going on behind the scenes, but it's very important that it's also presented to a wider public. And luckily that is taking place. The Chelsea Physic Gardens in London, which also has a very heavy colonial history, has recently installed some signage that definitely also in similar ways as some of these signs in the Huntington tries to address the exploitation of how the plants ended up in London.
Yes, I see. That's probably slowly coming on, but yeah. Any questions? I was actually quite surprised about the fact that you mentioned it, I think, in your first part of your talk, that there's not so much documents or notes on actually from the country or the people which know probably more about the plants. And I always have that, looking at, these big stories about finding and transporting plants to Europe. You always have the apprehension that they must have, get in contact with locals, otherwise the plant would have not survived. But they must have also written something down, or we know that from there, but it was preserved more on further notes or not. I'm really surprised that that's such a lack of information about the intercultural exchange, really. About
yes, of course, yes, this information does exist. It's I think it's important to highlight that we need, as institutions, as museums and carers of collections, to start the narrative much sooner than is often done. It's very often that the story starts with the so-called discovery, because that's where we, as institutions, have most of the written material, right? So there's another kind of work that has to go into securing that other perspectives are presented. And of course, it's a case-by-case study, as it is with other kinds of museum objects. The same is true for plants. Some botanists described a lot of their collaborations with indigenous populations and recognized the help that they got, because a lot of this information about the value and knowledge, the uses of the plants, was of course gained from these communities who lived among the plants. So they had a lot of help in finding which plants were so-called useful. So it's not always recorded, as I mentioned, but sometimes it is, and those stories definitely needs to have further pride of place, I would say.
Yeah, we're actually looking forward to this.
Yes.
To read more stories.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a question.
Thank you for your really, really, really interesting presentation. I was wondering, just you're talking of course in the botanical field, but could it be also the same? Could we make a parallel with the zoological field as well? Like, are there also good example for it, maybe in Great Britain? Because, like, we're used to those historical zoos where you have these big houses who are like a important tradition, I would almost say. And so, are there studies about it, or I was just wondering.
Yes, thank you so much. Very good question. I think for zoology as well as for botany, this is very much an area of museum studies that needs to be dug out in much more detail, because compared to, for instance, ethnographic collections, cultural historical material, art historical material, it has not received the same kind of focus. And it's been sort of allowed to be this, as I said, for botanical gardens, this nice walk in the park. You know, we are focusing on the aesthetic qualities and not of the sort of more problematic elements of it. And the same is true for many zoological collections or natural history collections in general. But also zoos, like late 19th century zoos, and how they also interpreted, again, this sort of, or stood for this exotic view of the world, right? Also by having so-called human zoos. That was part of them. So it was not simply a place to exhibit animals, it was also a place to exhibit humans. And these stories are there, and that it's not that long ago. It's a little more than 100 years ago. So these institutions have very heavy histories that needs to be addressed in further detail. And then, of course, it falls back to a larger conversation about what does it mean to display, and who has the power to display, who has the power to tell these stories, and in what ways. So I think, yes, zoological museums and also with living animals, zoos, are part of this tradition from the late 19th century.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, there's another question in front, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. And I have a question. Are there any written information about that locals came to Britain, or like the Britain, so the people from Britain like took locals back home for more information, or like them to be like gardeners or something like that? Like, yeah, are there any information about that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so this is actually really interesting and refers back to my upcoming book about glass houses in a Northern European context, because this was one of the ideas presented by some creators of glass houses in the 19th century, that to sort of have the full picture of the plants and objects from certain places, they should be cared for by gardeners from the places where the plants came from. So again, this actually speaks into what I was just saying about the so-called human zoos and display of living people, that there were these imaginations that you could present the world beyond Europe, not just through the plants and the stuffed animals and the objects, but also through its people who were, yes, brought to, I mean, this is after the official abolition of slavery, of course, but there's many examples of slave-like labor during these times. So people were convinced to come along on these trips, and not necessarily having been informed of the true nature of what they would then be put to.
Any more questions? If not, then I would like to thank you again for this very rich talk, and we would continue with our second talk. Thank you. I'm very happy to introduce to you our second speaker. Pavel Mutri is a PhD candidate at the Maastricht University in Brno, where he's awaiting the defense of his dissertation, Collection and Identity, Acquisition Strategies of the Slovak National Gallery in Bratislava, 1948 to 1956. His research focuses on the history of museums and galleries, particularly acquisitions and exhibition strategies after 1945, and on the presentation of Central European art in its cultural and political context. In 2023, he was awarded the Barter Fellowship for a research project on exhibition relations between Czechoslovakia and the GDR, 1945 to 1964. In 2024, he organized the international conference Collecting and Identity, Meanings and Interpretations in Bratislava, which addressed questions of identity in museums context. He currently works at the Museum Goch, where he is engaged in processing the collection and estate of Hiltrude Neumann. Today we hear him with the talk Collection Identities, Identity Theories, and the Collection of the Slovak National Gallery. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for introduction. I will also share.
Yeah, it's lovely. We can see it. We have to go in full view.
No. Then just a moment. So now it should work. I hope. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really glad that I can make my presentation about my research, from my dissertation. It was actually a huge research which I wrote, but I will try to somehow compress this into 30 minutes. About the content, at first I would place the question which somehow set the research of my research somehow. And then I would try to answer about this question, which is somehow focusing on the topic of the identity and the collecting through the different lens of the identity researching. And the third point, I would make a little bit resume because there are a lot of point of views, and it would be really nice to see how the different research fields look at this concept, and somehow also to point out that if it could be also possible to apply it on the individual collecting. My research started with some common theme about the collecting and about the expression that the collection reflect somehow the identity of the collector. We nowadays also in the research field use this metaphor really often, but it's also used quite oft also in the normal speeches. If I can show two of them, art collecting reveals more than a love for beauty. It reflects our identity, emotion, and cultural values. And the second one, museum collections are a reflection of cultural landscape and accordingly national identity. And I was somehow fascinating what means actually this reflecting the identity. What does it really means, and what does it means actually also the concept of the identity in the connection to the collecting sphere. Of course, I choose the topic of the Slovak National Gallery because I'm from Slovakia and I wanted to do my research about something from my country. And of course, somehow I was asking myself if it's possible to bring these two ideas or these two problems, topics together. And in Slovakia, it's really somehow too nice to show that the concept of identity is really actual in our country, because it's a really young country. It was somehow the Slovak state was somehow beginning of it was in 1939. So it's only 30, somehow circa 30 years of its existence. And it's still somehow the topic of questioning what we are as a nation and what is our identity. And of course, in the connection of the collecting, it's quite clear to look at the Slovak National Gallery, because as you can see, this question of the identity in the collecting sphere, or at least in the museum field, is quite often connected with also with the national identity, and this bringing together the Slovak national identity, Slovak National Gallery and national identity was for me somehow like, yeah, this is the point where I can bring it together. So my big question about my research was, what does it mean that the collection reflects the national identity, and especially in the case of the Slovak National Gallery, which was actually grounded in 1984. What means that it has much more longer history than the Slovak nation, Slovak state itself, and it's also really nice to see about the history of the Slovak National Gallery, how big was the role of this institution to then in the future in 1993 to set or to bring the Slovak state into existence. I already mentioned that this in the museum field, the topic, the concept of the identity is usually connected with the national identity itself. Of course, there are much more possibilities to interpret what should the museum do, but usually this big museum like the Slovak National Gallery or National Gallery in London, or also in Germany, the Museumsinsel are these museums which are somehow would like to show not only the objects on itself, but also in some context of the nationality and the state history. So also in the case of the Slovak National Gallery, it's a great topic, the national identity. What could be somehow the one point or one of these identity theories views, which I called museological approach or museological view, where somehow important was that the objects are somehow should be presented or collected in the specific condition of the country or of the landscape where they are. It's really clear that in the Slovak National Gallery, it was already written in the Act of the Slovak National Gallery, Section 3, that one of the tasks of the gallery in carrying out should be the special attention paid to the local art. So exactly the same principle like in Germany or in Spain or in the case of the Louvre. That it's not just some kind of museum in the discourse of the museums, or in the case of the art in the discourse of the art museums, but also it's much more political, social, and somehow complex topic. And of course, then is the question: what should be this local art? In the case of the Germany, of course, we can name, I think, Cranach, Dürer, or the German Expressionists. In the case of the Slovak National Gallery, are usually mostly named these three people. One is the Martin Benka, what was the founding personality, father of the Slovak modernists in the 1962. Another really interesting person is then Miloš Alexander Bazovský, which is commonly nowadays one of the most sold Slovak modernists in the Slovak country. So there is a really strong identification with this artist in the art world in the Slovakia. And the third one is a really new somehow identification with in the history of the Slovak art and also of the collecting, of course, is the Stanislav Filko and the Slovak conceptualism of the 60s, somehow in the connection to the world, the development of the world art somehow. These works, as you can see, were collected by the Slovak National Gallery, Martin Benka in 1935, so already in 4 years after the grounding of the Slovak National Gallery, and so on and so on. But then, with this connection that the gallery should focus on the local artists, it's surprising that, for example, in the Slovak National Gallery, there are the works also from the Hungarian artists, what is somehow not then comparable with this definition in the law of the Slovak National Gallery. Here you can see one picture of the Tifar Zempeli, which actually was the professor at the academy in Budapest. So had a really not so strong connection to the Slovak part of the then Hungarian kingdom, of course. But anyway, the Slovak National Gallery also bought this one picture. It's in the history of the collecting in the Slovak National Gallery, there was quite often discussed this connection to the Hungary. As at first, I would like to somehow quote it two sentences from the curatorial meetings. Curatorium was in the 50s the group of the people which were somehow organizing all the galleries, and at their meetings they were discussed all of the questions also about the collecting. And in this records there is also written, start of the quote, Dr. Günterova questions the artist's nationality and believes he cannot be included in Slovak art history. The other members of the committee, however, believe the artist is important for Slovakia because he comes from Slovakia. So you can see this is the actually the quotes exactly about this picture, and this somehow connection to the Slovakia should be for some of the members somehow the reason why should be Zempleni and a lot of other Hungarian artists part of the Slovak arts, and of course partially of the Slovak identity, of course in the really complicated sense, but they already was thinking about that the history of Slovakia is much more complicated, that it's not only about the Slovaks. And because of this, it was decided after this session that the Hungarian paintings should be part of the Slovak National Gallery, and the collection of the Slovak identity, and it was decided somehow in the reason that the same, I'm quoted it again now from the build, that the same people who are significant in Hungarian art are also significant for the Slovak art. So now we can see the question about the museological approach, that even if we are talking that, if the museum approach is talking about that museum should focus only on the local art, it's often somehow not true, and a lot of museums have in their collection also the paintings which are somehow not connected with a certain locality. Of course, it's then the question if they are shown in the exhibition. Usually not, of course, because it's really really difficult question, or a really difficult theme in the Slovak state, exactly because of this 30 years of its existence, and somehow to not to make the discussion in the wrong way. Let's see. Yeah. The second part of this critique on the focus on the local art brought already also the somehow the first director of the gallery when he was in his concept of the Slovak National Gallery, which is 42 pages of the ideas. He mentioned that the Slovak National Gallery is tasked with documenting all artistic activity in Slovakia through its collections. So it somehow everything what was made. And after that, he was also somehow pointing out that these are therefore first and foremost Slovak works of art in the territorial sense. That is, works created on Slovak territory by the work of temporary or permanent residents of Slovakia. So his view was primarily focused on that everything what is connected, or everything what is connected with the Slovakia in the sense of the art should be collected by the Slovak National Gallery because it has some connection to the Slovakia, and should be not only focused on this nationalist part of the collecting and the identity building. So another approach on the view on the topic of the identity is then much more focusing on the part of the identity much more than on the national, because questioning about the national identity somehow brought the research to use another lens how to understand this topic of the identity, and one of the basic one is of course the psychological philosophic one, where there is a big discussion about the identity as such. In this field, there is a lot of discussing about identity and its connection to the etymology of this word, where we can see the Latin origin in the word idem, what should somehow referent to the sameness, and a really revolution somehow point of view of the sameness and idem and identity showed then the Leibniz in his law, today is usually known as the Leibniz law, which name is identity of indiscriminables, and it says that entities X and entity Y are identical if every predicted possessed by X is also possessed by epsilon and vice versa. For the basic example is usually the ball. How to explain it? If we have two balls which have the and we would like to say that they are identical or the same, we should usually talk about all of the predicate or all of the qualities of these two balls. And if there should be, for example, the same size and same color, then usually we are saying that they are same and identical. But what is often happened is that we are still somehow forgetting about the space and time qualities. And then, of course, we are then in the space where two balls could never be the same or identical because they always have the different space are somehow situated in the different space. And this law somehow made a revolution about the identity and to saying that the identity should be somehow spoken only about the one object itself. Yeah, in the case of the one object, somehow if we are talking that the object should be same and it should be somehow same also in the time and the space, it's also then somehow the questionable thing. And in the case of the philosophical research, then we are focusing on the essence and looking for something what is never changing somehow by the object. Of course, if it should be everything like by the share, then it would be much more easier to understand everything. But it's usually not like that. And the problem, which is somehow connected with this identity, or seeing the identity like something what should be same or identical, is somehow connected with the story of the Theseus ship, which is really old story from the Athenian somehow ages, where the ship of the Theseus somehow were preserved and stored, and somehow, of course, if every part of the ship is changed, then rise the question if we could say that it's the same ship, if it's really after the time the Theseus ship. And of course, this is really somehow the sameness and somehow to to try to hold the things in the same instance. It's somehow not possible. And we have also the examples about the collecting, also in the field of the collecting. Of course, in the case of the Second World War, we can talk about the destroying a lot of or lost of a lot of the works. And of course, mainly in Germany, but also in Slovakia, by bombing, a lot of works were destroyed or lost. And then there is the question, not also only about the loss of the identity, but as common about the changing of the identity. Another example, in the case of the Slovak National Gallery, is also the time of the socialist period. At the right side, you can see, or you can see now the two pictures of one author, Alois Klimo. At the right side, you can see his painting from the 50s, and on the left side, you can see the painting from the late 60s. You can really see this difference, which somehow also show that that the identity is not connected somehow if the new objects come to the collection, or if somehow some of them are lost or somehow destroyed. It's also connected somehow with the development as such of the society, and also of the authors, and also, of course, also of the history of the object somehow, because in the Slovakia, for example, nowadays, if you are talking about the Alois Klimo, usually you are presenting the picture on the left, and the picture of the right is somehow not showing, or usually said that it's not somehow it's not the right example of the Klimo's work somehow. So if we are looking through the philosophic approach on the concept of the identity, it also have a lot of question with it, and to see on it like something what should be the same and not changing, it's actually not possible in the real world, because of the history of the object, not only the collection itself, but also of the objects themselves, changing of the informations, and with this also connected, of course, changing of the identities. This somehow bring us to the third approach, or the third view, what could be called as the sociological approach, where we can also look at the Klimo, that everything what is happening in the context of the society, in the context of the space, and as the object are part of the space, and these parts are part of the human space, then everything should be happens on the people. That's the view of the sociological approach, of course. And then because of this should be also the identity somehow depend on the people, and not only on the object themselves. Richard D. Jenkins, in his really famous work Social Identity, wrote that the identity does not belong to him. It is not a species of private property. It's created through the social interactions. So his opinion is that the identity is something what is made by the people themselves, and not the object. If we should apply it on the collecting, this approach, here is then the really nice example from the Slovak National Gallery, where we could speak about the acceptance of the society. It's also the main theme which is Jenkins somehow focusing on, that identity can exist, or if we are somehow we can talk about identity only if it is accepted by the society. I already mentioned the Miloš Alexander Bazovsky, and actually in the beginning of the Slovak National Gallery, it was really the time somehow when the social realism, what we could see also by the Klimo, was really somehow pushing thing also by the collecting. And because of this, his modernist period was somehow not collected in the Slovak National Gallery. If then they focus on his really somehow academic works from his beginning at the academy in Prague, what you can see somehow right down. Or then somehow if then Miloš Alexander Bazovsky wanted to somehow adapt to the social realist, then you can see at the links at the down left, somehow he's tried to adapt the social realism. In reality, actually, you can see that this picture was bought at the beginning of the 60s. So it is really nice to see that even if Bazowski tried to somehow fit for the social realist, it was not accepted actually in the 50s, and just in the 60s they somehow tried to accept it. This is actually, he made a lot of works in the 50s, of course, which tried to fit in the social realism. However, this is the only painting which was ever somehow collected from the Slovak National Gallery. So you can even here see how society, as the group of the people, could be really somehow crucial. How could be identity not only about the author, but also about the collection, and then also about the group itself. Somehow, how it depends on this acceptance of the society. Yeah. If we are talking about the acceptance, then, and about that somehow the artworks should be accepted by the society, and then we can talk about the identity of the group or of the collection. Then it raises another, these two works of Daumier raised another question, because they were somehow collected in 53, and after that they were never showed in the Slovak National Gallery. And today's, I think nobody knows that these graphics actually from Daumier are in the collection of the Slovak National Gallery. So it is again a question about the once again the question, and this time about the sociological approach. If we are talking about the identity as the acceptance, then why we have these two works somehow in the collection of the Slovak National Gallery, and how could collection of the Slovak National Gallery reflect the Slovak identity? It is also nice to see in this quotation from the purchasee that they even talk about nothing somehow. It is a valuable collection of English and French prints featuring many leading masters of both printmaking schools. There are no somehow question why it should be the part of the Slovak National Gallery somehow. And however, they are there. So if we how should we somehow stand against this fact actually? And the answer could be a fourth view on the identity concept, and it's the psychological approach, which is of course focusing on the really strong on the unconscious objects, or the information about the objects, and about the authenticity. Here, for example, from Paul van der Grijp, collecting is a matter of authenticity, of creating new identities, both of the object collected and by the extension of the collector. If we look at this quotation and the words of the Grijp, we can then see that somehow the collecting is not only about that what is somehow visible, but also about that what is invisible, and it's connected also to the collection and the collecting. In the case of the psychological approach, if we are talking about authenticity, we are also somehow talking about kind of the development, not only about the collector, like the person or the museum, but also about the development of the object. And through this development, they could still somehow come a new information, a new part of the identity to the object, or to the collection, to the society, to the collector. If I should show it at one example from the Slovak National Gallery, here I showed the two paintings from the László Mednyánszky nowadays, in the Slovak language Ladislav Mednyánszky. And it's really important to say that there is a difference between the Slovak naming and the nowadays one, because the first thing is that you can see as well as by the example of the Daumier, by this quotation, by buying the painting on the left, the portrait of the man. Mednyánszky unfinished portrait is interesting from a technical point of view, as it shows the artist's working method. So this quotation is actually at first really wrong, because it's not the unfinished portrait, it's the still style, how was Mednyánszky working. And the second, actually this quotation, it's again talking nothing about that. Why should be Mednyánszky somehow bought for the collection, and why it should be part of the Slovak identity? The reason actually why they bought these paintings, or there are a lot of actually paintings collected by the Slovak National Gallery, was that the Mednyánszky was born in Slovakia. So there was the preposition, of course, that it should be the Slovak artist, or even the last name Mednyánszky nowadays wrote in the sense of the Hungarian language, but the origin is from the Slovak language actually. So there was somehow the point of view that because of this it should be the Slovak artist. After many researchers, of course, they came with the information actually that the family, in reality, it's not the Slovak origin, but the Hungarian one. And this, of course, changed the whole story about the Mednyánszky, but also the whole story about this collection of the Slovak National Gallery and about the Slovak nation. So here we can see that something was somehow hidden in the psychological way, and it's after that showed really strong change the view on not only about the work itself but also about the collection as well. Another point is that the newest researchers found even that the Mednyánszky was gay. He wrote his own diaries, and from these diaries it's really strong to see that he was somehow part of the LGBTQR community. And this is also somehow something new, what definitely changed not only the collection of the Slovak National Gallery, but also the identity of the Slovaks and the Slovak state. It's really interesting to see it, because somehow LGBTQR topic, it's discussed a lot in the nowadays Slovak, and it's strongly refused actually from the Slovak. But if we see that this was part of our country even before, it cannot be somehow destroyed or somehow erased from our history. And what is most interesting is that the Ladislav Mednyánszky, even not in the collection of the Slovak National Gallery, but also on the art market, is the top-selling artist in the Slovakia, actually. What is really somehow unbelievable that someone who is LGBTQR is one of the most selling artists in our country, even if the country is strong against the LGBTQR rights. If I should somehow conclude the psychological approach, it's about the unconscious of the objects and of the information, which could be somehow redefined and rediscovered. And then bring to the identity of the group, of the collector, somehow the new parts and new points, new information. It's also about the development, that it's not something what is not moving, what is always same, but it's something what is always growing and growing and growing. And it's of course about the authenticity. I'm somehow coming to the conclusion of my presentation. Here we can see the 4 different approaching on the concept of the identity, which I spoke. Here we can see the case of the museum. We were talking about the museological approach, where we discussed the difference and the originality of the collection. Of course, there was raised the question about this, and it somehow could be not applied on itself. Then we showed a psychological approach where we were talking about the sameness and the continuity of the collection. And here we raised also another question, and we saw that it's not only about the continuity, and it's always somehow moving forward, the collection. Then we were talking about the sociological approach and about the acceptance, but as well we had a question about the works which are in the collection, but somehow in the case of the society, there are the works that doesn't exist, and then they cannot be somehow accepted, of course. And at the last, I was talking about the psychological approach when I somehow presented the concept of the authenticity and development, and that this should be also the part somehow of the identities, or the identity is made of the authenticity and the development. As I said, I was talking much more about the museums, but we can raise these all types of the approaches also on the individual collecting. We can look at the individual collector through the museological approach and to see his identity as something original. We could see it something what doesn't change over the time. We could see something that it's accepted also by the society and not on his own. And then we can see it also like something authentic, that it should not have to be original, it not have to be somehow same, it not have to be accepted, but it have to be lived. Now we have a lot of possibilities, have to understand the identity, but always with a question. And then it's the question if we can then understand the concept of the identity in the case of the collecting. What I would prefer, it's not somehow to say that, okay, everything is questionable, there is no possibility to make the definition about identity. Because we can bring all of these approaches together and see the identity in the somehow combination of all of these mentioned theories. Then identity would be the space where the different and sameness, continuity and change, acceptance and rejection, and authenticity and artificiality meet together. That's somehow the possibility how to understand the identity in a more complex way, and somehow can bring us to understand it much more complex and not just or only always with the one of these point of views somehow, where we are thinking much more somehow separate and focused and not so complex like the society actually, and the collecting and the concept of identity and identity of the collector actually is. Thank you for attention, and if you have the question, I'm glad to answer them.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving us this insight in the collecting policies of the Slovak National Gallery, and show us how problematic it is to form identity through a collection, and actually how shifting the idea or how identity is, and there's always needs to be negotiate what identity actually forms and what it constituted of. Yeah, and I think for the national, for the Slovak National Gallery is particularly sensible subject because of yeah, also the political dimension behind it. Are there any questions or comments? I think we have a question.
So, thanks a lot. My question is, are you taking in account who are the... No. Now you can hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, sorry, I didn't take it the right way. So, thanks a lot. I would like to hear if you are also interested in the producing of identity. That means the concrete actors at the museum are producing a special identity in exhibiting these pictures and so on. So that's another dimension of identity, not what it is, but who produced these kinds of identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, I could not focus on the exhibition policy, of course, because 6,000 objects to explain it in the context of the whole dissertation or the whole research was not possible. But of course, I focus also on the personalities of the curatorium, for example, this group of the people which were somehow decided which direction should the Slovak National Gallery go. And there were really different preferences, as I, for example, mentioned about this art historian Gunterova, what was one of the first actually women art historian in Slovakia already in the Middle War era. And then in somehow anti-protagonist of this was the Jan Mudroch, what was actually the artist and not the art historian, and he was somehow thinking more in this context of the art and history of art much more than only as something what should represent the nation or the country or the part of the then Czechoslovakia somehow. So there were also the preferences. It was not a lot of it because of course it should it would need somehow to make a research about the personal somehow about the peasants themselves, and to go to the archives of their somehow lives. But this was not part somehow of my research, because it would be a huge number of other archival materials. For example, then the director of the Slovak National Gallery, the third one, had his archive in Slovak National Gallery, but it's a huge mass of something of the material, and it should be I think it should be the research on itself and not somehow the part of it could be not the part of my dissertation research.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any more questions? I guess it's quite a wide field and there's a lot of input, and I think we all need to reflect on that a little bit more. So I suggest we let that settle a little bit and have a break. And thank you again very much for your talk. And I think we're coming back a little bit earlier. We had actually planned to have a half an hour break, but I think we have to shorten that a little bit, maybe to 20 minutes. So we will be back in 20 minutes. Thank you. Yeah, welcome back to our second half of this section for today. I would like to introduce our first speaker. Elisa Bernard holds a PhD in Analysis and Management of Cultural Heritage from the Schola IMT Alti Studi in Lucca, and is currently an assistant professor of classical archaeology at the Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen-Nürnberg. Her work moves across literary studies, ancient art history, heritage studies, and cultural memory, with a special interest in how societies, ancient and modern, curate, display, and reimagine their pasts. She is the editor of Memoria e Spazio Civico 2024 and a co-editor of Anthropology of Forgery 2019 and Beyond Forgery from 2022. Her monograph on museums in change is scheduled for release by BAR Publishing in Oxford in 2026. Please welcome Elisa Bernard, who talks today on Between Provenienz and Provenance, Negotiation Origins in Post-Unification Italian Museums.
Thank you, Daniela. Can you see my screen and hear me well?
Yes, it looks lovely.
Okay, great. So thank you, Daniela, and all the organizers for inviting me. I'm truly honored and thrilled. And tonight I will talk you on a journey to Italy, the period following its unification, to see how museums negotiated origins between provenience and provenance. Because museums do more than showcase objects. They shape the stories of origin and meaning that define how we understand our history. In post-unification Italy, the decision to present an artifact as evidence of its original context or as part of its storied collecting history was far more than a technical choice. It was central to the way Italy imagined its national identity. So this paper explores how Italian museums navigated the concepts of provenience, an object's find spot, and provenance, its documented ownership history, to craft displays that not only negotiated scholarly priorities, but also helped forge new cultural and civic identities. And by examining the interplay between these frameworks, we can uncover how Italian museums both interpreted and presented the past to the public in the late 19th century. The presentation is structured in three parts. The first, it reconstructs the theoretical debates surrounding the role and function of museums in post-unification Italy. The second and third sections examine case studies that prioritized either provenience through the reconstruction of archaeological contexts or provenance by foregrounding the history of collecting. The final section brings these strands together to show how Italian museums mobilize both concepts to shape public engagement with the past. In the decades following 1861, so the unification of Italy, Italian archaeologists, art historians, and politicians debated whether a unified national cultural policy was even possible, because they faced a fragmented heritage landscape, inherited from pre-unification states, each with its own distinct legal and institutional traditions. Two broad visions of the museum emerged. The first, articulated in the 1860s, 1870s by the art historian Giovanni Battista Cavalcaselle and the archaeologist Giancarlo Conestabile della Staffa, saw the museum primarily as a space for education and scholarly research. They advocated for central museums in each region, rooted in the city's historical and artistic traditions. So, for example, Florence as the center of Etruscan civilization and Renaissance art. A more politically driven vision came in the same period from the art historians Giovanni Morelli and Giuseppe Mongeri. While they also supported regional central museums, they envisioned a national role for Florence, then the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. As a gallery, the would, quote, present to the visitor the entire panorama of Italian art and its principal features, end quote. So in this way, museums began to serve as instruments not only of education, but also of national identity. By contrast, in the 1880s and 1890s, the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli and the art historian Adolfo Venturi, working within the Ministry of Public Education, championed a more hierarchical and scientifically grounded system. They emphasized conservation and historical accuracy over educational purposes. Fiorelli argued that artifacts derived their true value from their archaeological context and should, therefore, remain close to their place of origin. For him, provenience, understood as scientific documentation, imbued objects with the authority of historical evidence. As a result, Fiorelli envisioned a network of state museums at regional and sub-regional levels, while also encouraging provinces and municipalities to create local institutions. Venturi extended these visions to art museums, promoting a mosaic national gallery made up of local museums, each narrating a distinct regional history. Together, these institutions would compose what he famously described as, and I quote, the great book of Italian life, end quote. And these debates significantly influenced exhibition strategies. In terms of art history, Cavalcaselli favored organizing collections by regional schools and chronology, while Morelli and Mongeri prioritized chronology to emphasize stylistic relationships across regions. Venturi endorsed this latter approach, arguing that it supported comparative art historical research, despite the relative ease with which this method could be implemented in practice. Indeed, even Venturi's pupil, Corrado Ricci, who envisaged a time when galleries might be arranged by manner and period, once studies on the development of individual schools had sufficiently advanced, well, he found himself constrained by circumstance to adopt Cavalcaselli's system of schools and chronology at both the Brera and the Uffizi galleries in the early 1900s. And here you have a picture of Brera. Venturi also insisted that exhibitions would reflect the history of collections themselves, requiring careful archival research into provenance. His reorganization of the Estense Gallery in Modena exemplified this approach. The opening room was dedicated to the Ferrarese School, the original core of the collection, accompanied by portraits of the Este dukes. So such display foregrounded the genealogy of the collection itself, rather than presenting artworks as isolated aesthetic specimens. Parallel debates unfolded in the field of archaeology. From the 1870s onward, figures like Conestabile sought to reconcile positivist typological classification with topographical criteria, as exemplified by his work at the newly established Etruscan Museum of Florence, while still affirming the primacy of art historical development in the arrangement of figurative monuments. And this approach had been recently implemented by Giuseppe Fiorelli at the National Museum of Naples in the early 1860s. A decisive theoretical intervention also came from Luigi Picorini, a prehistorian, who argue that objects from the same archaeological context, such as tombs or hoards, should be preserved and displayed together. Thus, assemblages, they maintained, provided the most reliable evidence for cultural practices, chronology, and synchronism. Objects, when viewed collectively, could reveal social customs and technological traditions that individual artifacts could not. And the exhibition of intact Etruscan tombs detached from the Certosa necropolis by Antonio Zannoni and displayed at the Civic Museum of Bologna in 1871 represents an early model of the musealization of archaeological context, and it likely shaped Piccorini's later theoretical stance. A decade later, Fiorelli, who, as noted earlier, emphasized the importance of studying artifacts within their original context, advocated for museum displays that would, and I quote, demonstrate the accuracy with which the excavation had been carried out, by providing, through the arrangement of the objects, the necessary materials for study in accordance with its intended purpose, end quote. Despite the intensity of this debate, no official national guidelines were ever issued. And this absence reflects the difficulty of reconciling divergent disciplinary priorities and institutional interests. And it also underscores the extent to which museum practice remained contingent, shaped by local conditions, individual directors, and the nature of collections themselves. And the virtual promenade through post-unification archaeological museums that we will now embark on will demonstrate this. By the late 19th century, Italian museums increasingly adopted provenience-based displays. At a basic level, this involved grouping objects believed to come from the same context within a single vitrine or row. In more sophisticated examples, the archaeological context was evoked through photographs and drawings displayed alongside the objects. Particularly elaborate solutions emerged at the Egyptian Museum in Turin. After his 1904 discovery of the tomb of Nefertari, the favorite queen of Ramses II, in the Valley of Queens, Luxor, museum director Ernesto Schiaparelli, head of the newly founded Missione Archeologica Italiana in Egypt, conceived a 1:10 scale model of the tomb in walnut wood. Completed and displayed only in the 1930s under his successor, Giulio Farina, the model exemplified a fusion of documentary rigor with narrative ambition. Installed beside the original period objects, it offered visitors an immersive insight into the tomb's original spatial and aesthetic context. In more elaborate cases, remains from scientific excavations were reassembled into monuments, either with archaeological precision or with a deliberately immersive theoretical intent. A striking early example is the exhibition of Etruscan tombs staged at Pall Mall, London in 1837-1838 by the Campanari family. Reproduction of tombs from Etruscan sites such as Tarquinia, Bulci, and Bomarzo, complete with painted walls, original sarcophagi, and staged grave goods, were presented in a dimly lit setting navigated by lanterns, offering visitors a sensory simulation of archaeological discovery. While such theatrical, spectacular mise-en-scène, driven more by commercial appeal than scientific rigor, remained exceptional, evocative reconstructions informed by archaeological observation became increasingly common in 19th century museum practice. In Florence, Luigi Adriano Milani promoted the reconstruction of Etruscan tombs in the museum garden using original materials, arguing that this display served educational, documentary, and preservationist aims, while also enhancing the museum's appeal and boosting attendance and revenue. While many were neither exact replicas nor translations, as in the case of Bologna, but rather eclectic pastiche or idealized reconstructions, still the project embodied an ambitious synthesis of archaeological vision, documentary intent, and public engagement. In some cases, documentary precision and evocative presentation converged in research-based reconstructions that sought to approximate the original appearance of monuments, creating an evocative image of a reality that was no longer purely tangible. A notable example is the gallery of the Metopes of Silenus in Palermo, as conceived by Antonino Salinas. By reassembling architectural fragments and casts to reconstruct the Doric entablatures of archaic temples, Salinas not only showcased the monuments themselves, but also made their origins and historical trajectories legible, transforming the arrangement into a vast, puzzle-like reconstruction guided by both scholarship and imagination. Indeed, Salinas' ambition extended beyond scholarly reconstruction towards something more poetic. His installations sought to invoke the original landscapes of the monuments, allowing visitors to experience within the museum something of the scale, light, and harmony that Greek and Sicilian sculptors had intended. And this aspiration resonates with the evocative language of his 1865 inaugural lecture, when, speaking of the Athenian Acropolis, he described, and I quote, "the enchanting scene framed by columns of pure white marble beneath a sky of deep blue, where the sea gleams with a fiery hue like wine." End quote. So for Salinas, Mediterranean light and sky were not mere background. They were essential to understanding Greek art and the serene joy of its creators. Alongside Provenienz, so the history of collections was also made visible sometimes. And this is particularly evident in museum catalogs. In Palermo, Salinas organized the Dalpiteri collection not by the usual chronological, topographical, or thematic schemes, but in a way that resembled the historical collections to which the pieces and works belonged. So the Salnitano Museum, the Astudio Museum, the collection formerly kept in the Municipal Palace, etc. The strategy was intended not only to document provenance, but also to testify to and celebrate the enduring commitment of Palermo and Sicily to the preservation of the island's rich artistic and historical heritage. During Salinas' tenure, private objects and collections entering the museum, whether by donation or bequest, were also often exhibited as separate units, as seen in the Gallo and Malvagna cabinets. And here you have an image of the Malvagna cabinet. This not only honored the donors, but also encouraged future generosity. Catalogs consistently recorded the previous location of ownership of objects as well, ensuring that the original course of collections remained visible, even after their organization. In some cases, however, keeping private collections intact was not primarily a curatorial choice, but rather the result of external constraints, such as conditions imposed by donors in their wills. One example is the Paolozzi bequest of Etruscan antiquities to the Civic Museum of Chiusi near Siena in Tuscany. This required a collection to be displayed as a unified indivisible wall, replicating the donor's original arrangement. And this clashed with scholarly and spatial considerations, prompting a prolonged dispute between museum officials. Luigi Adriano Milani, the superintendent of museums and excavations of Etruria, and the architect behind Hughes's original display scheme, protested that the Paolotti cabinets installed by Bartolomeo Nogara, director of the Vatican Museums, encroached upon the main exhibition hall, disfiguring the scientific arrangement of the display and ultimately undermining scholarly narrative and visitor accessibility and control. So the policy affair illustrates how the visibility of prominence can disrupt interpretive cohesion. It also highlights the delicate balance between respecting donor intent, maintaining scholarly rigor, and serving both academic and public audiences. And it also raises important questions about how prominence can shape and that sometimes constrain museum authority and curatorial agency. So to conclude, in post-unification Italy, debates about the purpose of museums profoundly influenced the development of institutional infrastructure, acquisition practices, collection composition, and exhibition strategies, including approaches to presenting archaeological context and articulating the history of collections. While theoretical positions were often provisional, in practice, the origin of objects, whether archaeological provenience or collecting provenance, played a central role in display strategies. Provenience-based reconstructions of archaeological context aim to preserve fragile evidence, communicate it to scholars, and democratize access to cultural heritage, while also captivating the public by evoking a sense of temporal and spatial displacement or dramatizing the moment of discovery. This was intended not only to enhance public engagement, but also elevate institutional prestige and, importantly, increase revenue. At the same time, making provenance visible reinforced the perceived endurance of objects and the continuity of local collecting traditions. It celebrated individual donors and their civic contributions, encouraged future gifts and bequests, and fulfilled stipulations tied to legacies and donations, often shaping and sometimes constraining curatorial autonomy. So while the emphasis on provenience as scientific evidence and cultural testimony reflected scholarly aims, the visibility of provenance often served institutional practices, commemorative agendas, and civic aspirations. Recognizing the interplay between these two dimensions is crucial to understanding how museums historically mediated between research, public engagement, and the construction of cultural identity. On the slide, the Italian case remains particularly instructive for broader discussions of provenance and its implications in museum practice today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. Yeah, it's always interesting to see that there are a lot of debates and academic approach to display strategies, but there are also other demands and conditions, restrictions, which you, clearly shown there has to be meditated and to see how these all come together. I find very interesting the strong appeal on reconstructing and contextualizing objects in a museum around 1800, and it's just kind of, I think there are parallels also in German museums where we see that kind of approach. I mean, that's kind of the wish we will probably still have in a way to restore kind of the whole picture, which seems to be long lost, and also to see the same approach towards collection, to show these in their context. I don't know really if that was done so much for German museums, actually, Brian. Yeah, would be interesting to know. Any questions? Hard to believe. Yes, we have a question.
So thanks a lot. Yeah, it works. Thanks a lot for your museological approach on display strategies. And I know that, or you asked, or Daniela asked, if we have such research in Germany. I think not really much, because it's not so easy to make or research in historical exhibitions. And so my question is a little bit, what are your sources? I think that's really a problem of historical museology, having a lot of sources, because mostly we don't have any photos or something like this, or no sources from archives or other documents. And so I would be very interested, what are your sources? And I know that's really not easy to do it, yes.
Thank you very much for this question, which is very relevant also from the methodological point of view. I've been quite lucky because the museums I've studied preserved a good record of archival materials that makes it possible to get a glimpse of the displays, even when historical pictures are missing. We start having pictures at the beginning of the 20th century, honestly. Before that, it's quite hard. But we have, for instance, the plans of how the collections were distributed, letters exchanged by museum directors that really want to make some changes in the museum, but they cannot do it without the authorization of the municipal authority, if they are civic museum, the ministry, if they are state museums. So this correspondence is very revealing. It tells a lot of the ambitions, sometimes frustrated ambitions, because this cannot be put into practice, but also what is eventually achieved. Museum catalogs also allow to do this to a certain extent, at least. It's easier with Provenienz because quite often this is something that art historian Corrado Ricci also states as a methodological invitation. Catalogs should keep trace of where the collection come from. So donors, but also for religious objects, which church did they come from? So this is easier to retrace through catalogs, even if then in the exhibition is more obscure. So yes, these are the sources. Catalogs, archival documentation, so correspondence, but also the writings of museum directors. They give us a glimpse of what are their interests. So if someone is interested in the Etruscans, we'll do more in the Etruscan wing than the Greek or Roman wing. So we have this kind of things. And then all the schemes that accompany this, correspondence, minutes of meetings, because directors cannot act alone, they discuss with their panel. So there's something that can be used to do that, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any more questions? I think it's quite rich material, and I think would be worse for all of us, to study it more. And I see also parallels to English museums where it's the same problem with documentation. Photographs are usually, from the beginning of the 19th century. You find hardly anything from the 18th, probably some prints in journals, but it's something quite frustrating. But very exciting subject. So if there are no questions anymore, I think we proceed to our last speaker for today. Thank you again very much for your talk. Ja, als unseren Abschlussredner für diesen heutigen Tag begrüße ich Frau Annette Lössecke. Da ist sie auch schon. Sie ist Professorin für Kunstwissenschaft mit dem Schwerpunkt New Museum Studies und Vizepräsidentin für Forschung und künstlerische Entwicklung an der Hochschule für Bildende Künste Braunschweig. Zuvor war sie Studiengangsleiterin und Lecturer oder beziehungsweise Assistant Professor für Cultural and Creative Industries Management an der University of Sheffield and Adjunct Lecturer for Museum Studies an der NYU, der New York University Berlin und der Amsterdam University of the Arts. Ihre Schwerpunkte in Forschung und Lehre liegen in den Bereichen Museumsstudien, in superdiversen, hypervernetzten Gesellschaften, Publikums- oder Stakeholder-Forschung, ökologisch und sozial nachhaltige Museumspolitik und Kulturdiplomatie, internationale kulturelle Beziehungen. Sie hat zahlreiche Publikumsforschungsstudien durchgeführt, gemeinsam mit der Museumsakademie Johanneum Graz, wie die Veranstaltung Aktivismus und Museum von 2022 in Berlin, Museum, Klimaaktion, kulturelle Dimensionen der Klimakrise 2021 in Wien und Diversify Your Audience 2018, Museum für Islamische Kunst Berlin. Seit 2026 ist sie Boardmitglied bei ICFA, also Museum of Fine Art. Hören Sie heute mit dem Vortrag Umstrittenes Kulturerbe im postdigitalen Berlins Pergamon-Panorama-Ausstellung. Herzlich willkommen.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank für die Einladung erstmal. Ich freue mich sehr und vielen Dank auch für die freundliche Einleitung. Wir sind hier online. So, jetzt müsste es da sein. Dann starte ich mal direkt am Beispiel der Sammlung des Berliner Pergamon-Museums und der digital gestützten Pergamon-Panorama-Ausstellung von Yadega Azizi. Auch in Berlin stelle ich einige Fragen zur digitalen Rekonstruktion von kulturellem Erbe, das als in Anführungsstrichen umstritten gilt. Ich gehe mal davon aus, dass die meisten von Ihnen das Pergamon-Museum kennen, auch wenn es jetzt schon längere Zeit mindestens zur Hälfte geschlossen ist und auch noch eine Weile geschlossen sein wird und vielleicht auch die digital basierte Panorama-Ausstellung gegenüber. Ich schaue insbesondere darauf, wie historische Narrative, etablierte Stereotype und interpretative Frameworks, die von der historischen permanenten Ausstellung etabliert wurden, mittels des unkritischen Einsatzes, wie ich finde, digitaler Technologien in die Gegenwart transportiert, statt kritisch hinterfragt werden. Mein Vortrag ist im Kontext aktueller Debatten zu fragwürdigen Akquisepraktiken, Provenienzforschung, Restitutionsforderungen und materieller wie kultureller Aneignung zu sehen und wie diese Themen in Museen adressiert, geframed und kommuniziert werden. Im Kontext von Diskussionen zum Postdigitalen verstehe ich digitale Transformationen nicht nur als Implementierung neuer Technologien, sondern vor allem auch als soziale und kulturelle Praktiken. Vor diesem Hintergrund interessiert es mich besonders nachzuvollziehen, wie die KuratorInnen der Panorama-Ausstellung digitale Technologien nutzen, um Expertise in Anführungsstrichen zu generieren und zu vermitteln und das Museum als wissenschaftliche statt historisch-koloniale oder in diesem Fall imperialistische Institution zu framen. Zum Pergamon-Museum. Das Pergamonmuseum wurde 1930 nach langer Bauzeit unter anderem eröffnet, um die seit dem Deutschen Kaiserreich im Zuge von Ausgrabungen im sogenannten Nahen Osten nach Berlin verbrachten Fragmente antiker monumentaler Gebäude rekonstruieren und ausstellen zu können. Das Pergamonmuseum beherbergt heute Teile der antiken Sammlung mit dem Pergamonaltar und dem römischen Markttor von Milet oben im Bild, die Sammlungen des Vorderasiatischen Museums mit dem babylonischen Ishtar-Tor, beide unten, und das Museum für islamische Kunst mit der Mschatta-Fassade aus Jordanien zum Beispiel, leider nicht im Bild. Die meisten Grabungsfunde wurden als Fragmente nach Berlin gebracht und zu monumentalen Architekturfassaden zusammengesetzt. Entstehende Lücken wurden mit modernem Material gefüllt, wie man hier ganz gut sehen kann auf den Bildern. Der Pergamonaltar zum Beispiel war eine Ruine, als deutsche Ingenieure ihn zum ersten Mal sahen. Vermutlich hat der antike Altar ungefähr so ausgesehen. Das Exponat, das heute als sogenannter Pergamonaltar ausgestellt wird, ist eine Rekonstruktion eines Teils des zerstörten antiken Altars nach damaligem Stand der Forschung. Im selben Raum ausgestellt sind die originalen Fragmente des Frieses, die den antiken Altar schmückten. Als sogenannter Pergamonaltar wird also die wissenschaftshistorisch durchaus interessante Rekonstruktion rezipiert, die sozusagen den kuratorischen Kontext für die Originalfriese liefert. Oder anders gesagt, der Pergamonaltar kontextualisiert sich selbst, wie es einer meiner Studierenden mal nannte. Die Ausgrabungen und teils fragwürdigen Umstände, unter denen die antiken Fragmente nach Deutschland gebracht wurden, sind gut erforscht und publiziert. Dennoch macht das Museum diese interessanterweise nicht direkt zum Thema, wie man vielleicht erwarten könnte im Zuge aktuell endlich geführter, muss man sagen, Debatten um Akquisepraktiken in kolonialen oder wie hier imperialen Kontexten. Das Museum setzt sich nicht transparent damit auseinander, dass die eigenen Vorgänger versuchten, den Ball flach zu halten sozusagen, um vor Ort möglichst keine Aufmerksamkeit darauf zu lenken, welchen archäologischen Wert die Grabungsfunde besaßen. Stattdessen wird auf historischen großformatigen Wandgemälden der historischen Grabungsstätten in mehreren Sälen und auf fotografischen Abbildungen die Grabungs- und Forschungstätigkeit des Museums veranschaulicht. Mit diesen historischen Gemälden, Fotografien und Texttafeln wird der Beitrag des Museums zur Bildung neuer akademischer Disziplinen seit dem 19. Jahrhundert hervorgehoben. Das heißt, das Museum bemüht sich seit 1930 und bis heute, sich das Image einer Forschungseinrichtung zu geben, unter anderem dadurch, dass es neben den monumentalen Rekonstruktionen seine historische archäologische Forschungstätigkeit illustriert. Ausliegende Informationsblätter und Wandtexte beziehen sich vorzugsweise auf die von dem ausgestellten Exponaten vermeintlich symbolisierten antiken Kulturen. Präsentiert werden die Exponate als gleichsam zeitlose architektonische Meisterwerke in Anführungsstrichen und vermeintlich ikonisches Kulturerbe. Die Museumswebsite hebt die immersiven Qualitäten der Dauerausstellung hervor, Zitat: Aus den Originalziegeln, die aus Zehntausenden Bruchstücken zusammengesetzt wurden, konnten Teile der Anlage in annähernd originaler Größe nachgebaut werden, sodass die Besucher sie durchwandeln können. So entsteht ein Bild von 6000 Jahren Kunst- und Kulturgeschichte. Zitat Ende. Die Transformation von politisch und kultisch bedeutenden antiken Monumenten in ikonische Ausstellungsstücke wird nicht kritisch thematisiert. Welche aktive Rolle das Museum also im Kontext des Deutschen Kaiserreichs und danach gespielt hat, ist nicht Thema der Dauerausstellung. Reflektiert wird also nicht, in welchen historischen und aktuellen Kontexten Museen Wissen generieren, inwiefern sie selbst interpretative Rahmen zur Produktion dessen etabliert haben, was dann jeweils als Wissen galt, wie wir alle als Gesellschaft heute damit umgehen könnten, wer die Adressatinnen und Adressaten waren und sind, und wie das in heutigen superdiversen, global vernetzten Gesellschaften rezipiert und interpretiert wird oder werden könnte. Das war jetzt zugegeben der Zeit geschuldet natürlich ein sehr, sehr, sehr schneller Durchgang durch einige sehr problematische Aspekte der Displays, der sozusagen historischen Displays aus den 1930ern, die doch zu sehr großen Teilen auch heute noch im Pergamonmuseum oder bis vor kurzem im Pergamonmuseum noch zu besichtigen waren. Und ich gehe jetzt weiter zur Panorama-Ausstellung. Wegen Renovierungsarbeiten, wie wir alle wissen, am Pergamonmuseum ist der Pergamonaltar derzeit nicht ausgestellt. Die entsprechenden Ausstellungsräume sind seit 2014 geschlossen und werden voraussichtlich erst in einiger Zeit wieder eröffnet. Als Ersatz sozusagen wurde 2018 die temporäre Ausstellung mit dem Titel Pergamon, Meisterwerke der antiken Metropole und 360-Grad Panorama von Yadiga Azizi eröffnet. Die Ausstellung wird in einem extra errichteten temporären Gebäude schräg gegenüber dem Pergamon-Museum am Kupfergraben gezeigt. In der Ausstellung werden die ca. 80 Exponate aus der Antikensammlung der Staatlichen Museen zu Berlin dramatisch inszeniert. Kleinere Bereiche widmen sich etwa der Stadtgeschichte des antiken Pergamon oder der Museumsgeschichte und den Ausgrabungen. Also die Museumsgeschichte und die Ausgrabungen werden also tatsächlich dargestellt. Also man sieht das hier, Reproduktionen von antiken Fotografien, manche zusammengeschnitten zu Videos. Aber wir sehen, wie das im Verlauf des Vortrags eben, wie das Museum sonst damit umgeht. Der zentrale Raum mit dem Panorama nimmt ungefähr die Hälfte der Ausstellungsfläche ein. Die rund 3000 Quadratmeter große textile Bildfläche erstreckt sich als 360-Grad-Rundbild über einen Umfang von 104 Metern und einer Höhe von 30 Metern. In der Mitte des Raums steht ein 15 Meter hoher begehbarer Turm, von dessen 3 Aussichtsplattformen man aus dem Zentrum heraus das gesamte Rundbild auf verschiedenen Höhen betrachten kann. Das Panorama ist zu wechselnden Tages- und Nachtzeiten zu sehen und mit sanften Melodien und Stimmengewirr untermalt, die Alltag simulieren. Laut Broschüre stelle das Panorama, Zitat, antike Lebenswirklichkeit dar und erzählt in großen und kleinen Geschichten, wie die Bewohner Pergamons vor 2000 Jahren ihre Stadt erlebten. Zitat Ende. Der Künstler Yadiga Azizi spricht von einem monumental immersiven Panorama. Zu sehen ist die antike Akropolis von Pergamon, die römische Unterstadt und die umgebende Landschaft. In einer statischen Montage sind Fotografien von Komparsen in antikisierenden Kostümen mittels Greenscreen-Verfahren in die digital rekonstruierte Architektur montiert. Zu sehen sind fiktionalisierte Alltagsszenen, aber zum Beispiel auch der sogenannte Sklavenmarkt, oben rechts, nahezu unkommentiert. Hier nochmal im Zoom. Die am Ticketschalter ausliegende Broschüre vermerkt lediglich, Zitat, die Sklaverei und eine gewisse Ausbeutung zahlloser Unfreier ist der negativste, oft übersehene Aspekt der antiken griechischen Kultur. Selbst für den großen Philosophen Aristoteles waren Sklaven lediglich Menschenfüßler und sie wurden wie Waren gehandelt. Zitat Ende aus der Broschüre. In irgendeiner Form kritisch kontextualisiert wird die Darstellung des sogenannten Sklavenmarktes nicht. Und es gibt noch weitere sensationsheischende, wie ich sagen würde, Details. Im Innenhof des Pergamonaltars ist etwa ein Brandopferaltar zu erkennen. Die Stufen davor sind dramatisch getränkt vom Blut der Opfertiere. Historisch belegt ist allerdings nicht, welche Funktion der Pergamonaltar hatte und ob überhaupt Brandopfer dargebracht wurden. Hier wurde offenbar zugunsten eines dramatischen Effekts auf wissenschaftliche Genauigkeit und Transparenz verzichtet. Auffallend ist jedoch, dass der große Fries wohl historisch akkurat als Polychrom dargestellt wird, anders als in der Rekonstruktion des Altars im Pergamon-Museum, also im historischen Pergamon-Museum. Zusätzlich zum Panorama gibt es eine weitere digital basierte Installation. Da die Originale des großen Gigantenfrieses aus konservatorischen Gründen nicht gezeigt werden können, werden deren digitale Rekonstruktionen an den Außenwänden eines Pergamon-Altar-Modells in einer videoähnlichen, wandfüllenden Projektion gezeigt. Wie auf den historischen Displays im Pergamon-Museum werden auch in dieser Projektion die virtuellen Rekonstruktionen im Kontext der Fundstätte allerdings in heutigem Zustand gezeigt. Die Ruinen sind im Vordergrund hier zu erkennen. Im Verlauf der Projektion blendet die virtuelle Rekonstruktion im Kontext dynamisch hinüber in das im Pergamon-Museum rekonstruierte ikonische Prunkstück des Museums. Im Zentrum dieser digitalen Animation steht also das von deutschen Archäologen aus Tausenden von Bruchstücken mühsam rekonstruierte ikonische Museumsstück und nicht das historische Bauwerk. Zu erkennen an der Glasdecke des Pergamon-Museums oben rechts und natürlich der Monochromfassung auch des großen Frieses. Das auch wieder sehr gekürzt, das ist mir klar, aber der Zeit geschuldet sehr kurz zur Panorama-Ausstellung. Ich möchte noch ein bisschen was sagen zu Blind Spots, wie ich der Ausstellung und des Displays im Pergamon-Museum, wie ich es nennen würde, und zu einer Lehrveranstaltung, die ich dazu vor Jahren mit Studierenden durchgeführt habe. Beide Ausstellungen, also das Museum und das Panorama, habe ich mir mit Studierenden besucht. Erörtert worden sollten insbesondere die folgenden Blind Spots eben der Ausstellung. Erstens zum Versuch, die antike Lebenswirklichkeit der Bewohner zu fiktionalisieren. Inwiefern reproduziert eine derart trivialisierende, historisch vermeintlich authentische Perspektive bestehende Stereotype, wenn diese unkommentiert präsentiert werden? Achten sollten die Studierenden zum Beispiel auf stereotype Darstellungen von Gender oder auf exotisierende, rassistische Darstellungen, wer in welcher Rolle zu sehen ist, etc. Der kurze Verweis in der Broschüre auf vermeintlich authentische Lebenswirklichkeiten reicht zur Klärung hier wohl nicht aus. Zweitens zum kuratorischen Ansatz, in beiden Ausstellungen vorgeblich antike Kulturen auszustellen und dazu digital basierte immersive Inszenierungsstrategien einzusetzen, um den vermeintlichen Originalkontext authentisch erlebbar zu machen. Deutlich wurde, inwiefern es die disziplinäre archäologische Perspektive auf einen sogenannten Originalkontext erlaubt, geflissentlich über zweifelhafte Akquisepraktiken und materielle wie auch kulturelle Aneignungen hinwegzugehen. Auch wenn in beiden Ausstellungen die Geschichte der Ausgrabungen und Rekonstruktionen thematisiert wird, an dieser großen Eingangswand, die ich eingangs gezeigt habe, so geschieht dies doch eher am Rande und auf sehr selbstgewisse, imagebildende Weise und nicht in selbstkritischer Absicht. Drittens zur Produktion von Wissen. Ich habe kurz beschrieben, wie in beiden Ausstellungen der Ausstellungsgegenstand als historisch authentisch dargestellt wurde und wie dazu jeweils neueste archäologische bzw. digitale Techniken eingesetzt wurden. Zu fragen ist, inwiefern die sogenannten Strategien zur Produktion von Wissen sozusagen einen Vorwand liefern, das Museum als disziplinäre Forschungseinrichtung und nicht etwa imperialistisch geprägte Institution zu positionieren. Inwiefern versuchen Museum und Ausstellung durch solch ein imagebildendes Framing eine selbstkritische Auseinandersetzung mit aktuellen museumspolitischen Debatten zu vermeiden? Inwiefern entzieht sich das Museum damit einer Auseinandersetzung mit seiner Rolle und Verantwortung in heutigen superdiversen Gesellschaften? Viertens, in beiden Ausstellungen ist der analog bzw. digital rekonstruierte Ausstellungsgegenstand als multimedial zu bezeichnen, denn beide Ausstellungen erzeugen ihren als authentisch geframten Ausstellungsgegenstand im Zusammenspiel verschiedener Medien. Rekonstruktionen, Wandgemälde, Fotografien hier, also im alten Pergamonmuseum, digital basiertes Panorama, Multimedia-Installationen, digitale Videoprojektionen in der neuen Panorama-Ausstellung. Der Einsatz und die Nutzung von Medien erfolgen also nicht binär als analog oder digital, sondern hybrid, als komplexes postdigitales Interplay. Zusammengefasst in der Panorama-Ausstellung werden bestehende Narrative mittels neuer, eben digitaler Technik eher fortgeschrieben oder gar verstärkt, statt herausgefordert und in Frage gestellt. Und das vor dem Hintergrund der erwähnten museums- und gesellschaftspolitischen Diskussionen zur Rolle von Museen in heutigen geografisch und sozial komplexen Gesellschaften. Zur Perspektive der Studierenden ganz kurz. Bei der abschließenden Präsentation der Studierenden kritisierten einige Arbeitsgruppen in der Tat den fehlenden kritischen Umgang der Ausstellung mit der problematischen Akquisegeschichte der Sammlung. Vorgeschlagen wurde zum Beispiel die Entwicklung einer interaktiven App, mit der BesucherInnen unter anderem die Transparenz des Museums und der Ausstellung in Bezug auf ihre eigene Geschichte bewerten konnten. Die berechneten Scores verschiedener Museen sollten dann via Social Media öffentlich einsehbar und vergleichbar sein. Auf diese Weise, so der Vorschlag der Studierenden, könne über Social Media Transparenz und eine Art kritischer Öffentlichkeit über den Umgang von Museen mit ihrer potenziell zweifelhaften Vergangenheit hergestellt werden. Interessanterweise kam von einigen Studierenden allerdings auch große Zustimmung zum Format des Panoramas. Positiv hervorgehoben wurde vor allem, dass das Panorama erlebnisorientiert sei und das Thema anschaulich vermittle. Dadurch sei der Zugang zum Gegenstand ihnen viel leichter gefallen als durch die traditionelle objektzentrierte Präsentation im Pergamonmuseum. Dabei werde klar, so die Studierenden, dass die Inszenierung over the top sei und als fiktiv, eben als Inszenierung interpretiert werden müsse. So zumindest die Einschätzung einiger Studierender. Die Zustimmung der Studierenden bezog sich dabei sowohl auf das digital basierte Panoramaformat als auch auf die beschriebene dramatische Ausstellungsgestaltung zur Inszenierung der Originale aus der Sammlung, also insgesamt auf eine dramaturgisch anregende Inszenierung aus digitalen und analogen Elementen. Diese ausgesprochen positive Einschätzung behielten die betreffenden Studierenden auch dann bei, nachdem wir die vorhin genannten problematischen Punkte diskutiert hatten, was mich durchaus etwas erstaunt hat, muss ich sagen. Es wäre interessant, da nochmal ein Seminar zuzumachen und zu sehen, woran das liegen könnte oder wie genau da die Einstellungen und die Erfahrungswelten dann eben auch sind. Was sind nun die Implikationen für Forschung, kulturelle Vermittlung und akademische Lehre? Erstens sollte empirische Besucherinnenforschung stets als explizit kritische Forschung praktiziert werden. Etwas polemisch, es reicht nicht, Erwartungshaltungen abzufragen oder zum Beispiel Apps oder Ähnliches zu entwickeln, die auf ein verändertes Nutzungsverhalten eingehen, mehr Informationen bereitstellen oder auch zusätzliche Perspektiven liefern, während das zu kritisierende Museumsdisplay selbst unverändert bleibt, auch wenn es historisch so eben ist wie im alten Pergamonmuseum. Vielmehr ist eine kritische Analyse von empirischen Ergebnissen nötig, insbesondere zu stereotypen Auffassungen und Einstellungen zu kontroversen Themen, etwa im Hinblick auf die erwähnten Debatten zur Restitution und Dekolonisierung. Zu erforschen wären zum Beispiel auch Emotionen wie Nostalgie oder Ressentiments, Wertehaltungen und Überzeugungen des Publikums quer durch das politische Spektrum und inwiefern diese gerade in Bezug auf sogenanntes umstrittenes Kulturerbe von der neuen alten Rechten zum Beispiel instrumentalisierbar sind. Ja. Zweitens sind Rezeptions- und Nutzungsprozesse und Praktiken stärker zu erforschen. Warum erlebt jemand etwas in welcher Weise? Warum wird etwas als anregend empfunden? Warum als eintönig oder opak und undurchdringlich? Wie strukturiert etwa die Ausstellungsgestaltung den Rezeptionsprozess? In welchen Kontexten aus Feedback und Assoziationen wird der Museumskontext heute erlebt? Aber eben auch und gerade vor dem Hintergrund umstrittenen Kulturerbes, wovon mag eine dramaturgisch ausgefeilte Ausstellungsgestaltung ablenken, wenn das Museum es darauf anlegt? Drittens, statt vorrangig das Nutzungsverhalten digitaler Angebote zu betrachten, ist das hybride Interplay von analogen und digitalen Elementen zu erforschen. Statt der Nutzung digitaler Tools ist das Navigieren durch postdigitale Infrastrukturen zu analysieren im Museums- oder Ausstellungsraum und darüber hinaus, in den komplexen Verflechtungen, in denen sich BesucherInnen zurechtfinden müssen. Das schließt natürlich auch den gesamten Kontext, die Produktion und die Nutzung von offiziellen, institutionellen wie auch privaten Social-Media-Kanälen ein, die ich hier aus Zeitgründen gar nicht berücksichtigt habe. Also weder hier im Vortrag noch habe ich dazu bislang geforscht. Viertens sind digitale Techniken und Infrastrukturen in kritisch-historischer Perspektive zu vermitteln, um Strukturen, narrativ prägende Affordanzen und Effekte verschiedener Medien auf NutzerInnen erkennen zu können. Die historische und darin politische Situierung von verschiedenen Medien wurde in meinem Beispiel im Vergleich der historischen Dauerausstellung und der temporären Panoramaausstellung deutlich, wie ich hoffe. Historisch und digital rekonstruierte Werke sind als konzeptuell dynamisch zu verstehen, wie die verschiedenen historischen und digitalen Rekonstruktionsvarianten des sogenannten Pergamonaltars veranschaulichen. Die Möglichkeiten digitaler Technologien sollten genutzt werden, um zum Beispiel wettstreitende oder auch konfliktreiche Narrative offenzulegen, statt zu glätten, und kuratorische ebenso wie digitale Affordanzen im Zentrum der Ausstellung stehen. Statt historische Narrative zur vorgeblichen Erhaltung von Kulturerbe sollten die konzeptuellen Friktionen bezüglich der Rekonstruktionsbemühungen des Museums thematisiert und die entwickelten interpretativen Rahmungen als historisch situiert und fluide vermittelt werden. Fünftens sind in Forschung, Lehre und Vermittlung theoretische Rahmungen und die Produktion von Wissen in historischer Perspektive in Bezug auf ihre materiellen und konzeptuellen Infrastrukturen vermehrt zu untersuchen. Wie historisch-konzeptuelle Aneignungen und aktuelle Reinterpretationen in der superdiversen Gesellschaft zu diskutieren sind, hätte ein Thema der Ausstellung werden können. Wie sich Wissenssysteme gerade auch in postdigitalen Zeiten verändern und welche AkteurInnen, Räume, Netzwerke etc. auszumachen sind, müsste mehr Platz nicht nur in der Forschung, sondern auch in der Lehre und Vermittlung einnehmen. Historisch zu situierende Kontexte der Wissensproduktion zu interpretieren, wird gerade in Zeiten umso wichtiger, in denen Kultureinrichtungen, Museen, Forschungseinrichtungen und Hochschulen extrem unter Druck geraten bzw. gezielt ins Visier genommen werden, muss man ja wohl mittlerweile sagen. Angesichts der erwähnten aktuellen museumspolitischen Debatten werden Museen auch in der postdigitalen Gesellschaft nur dann relevant bleiben, wenn wir Publikums- und Teilhabeforschung in dieser Hinsicht kritisch neu denken in Bezug auf die Produktions- und Rezeptionskontexte von Wissen und interpretativen Rahmungen, wie hier skizziert. Das würde bedeuten, empirische Publikums- und Teilhabeforschung erweitert als Stakeholderforschung, wie ich es nennen möchte, zu konzipieren, die nicht nur den vermeintlichen Markt, sondern das gesamte postdigitale Ökosystem verschiedener AkteurInnen empirisch unter die Lupe nimmt. Zwar wurden für die Panoramaausstellung mit einigem technischen Aufwand fiktionale, digital basierte Räume erschaffen, diese stellen sich aber in die Tradition immersiver, auf Überwältigung angelegter Inszenierungen aus dem 19. und frühen 20. Jahrhundert und spinnen etablierte, verschleiernde, überkommene Narrative fort, statt diese kritisch zu hinterfragen. Indem sie die Rolle deutscher ForscherInnen und MuseumsexpertInnen bezüglich der materiellen und konzeptuellen Aneignung und des Framings von Kulturerbe herunterspielen, ignorieren Museen wie Ausstellungen die historischen wie auch aktuellen gesellschaftlichen Kontexte, in denen Forschende und MuseumsexpertInnen Wissen und interpretative Frameworks produziert haben, die zu unterschiedlichen Zeiten erzeugen, was jeweils als Wissen gilt. Statt aufzudecken, verschleiert die Ausstellung, inwiefern die Entwicklung und Nutzung digitaler Technologien hier in teils umstrittene historische Praktiken der Wissensproduktion eingebunden sind. Während sie zwar Kommunikations- und Interpretationspraktiken des 21. Jahrhunderts bedient, stellt die Panoramaausstellung nur alte Fragen. Aus akademischer Sicht ist die Panoramaausstellung eine interessante Fallstudie dazu, wie digitale Ansätze an etablierten Begriffen, Konzepten und Narrativen festhalten können, statt postdigitale Infrastrukturen als kulturelles Feld mit seinen Risiken und Möglichkeiten zu erforschen. Eigentlich schade um die verpasste Chance. Vielen Dank.
Ja, also ganz herzlichen Dank für diesen unglaublich dichten Vortrag, also und auch die wirklich kritische und aufschlussreiche Beleuchtung von eher, man müsste schon sagen, eher unkritischer Ausstellungspraxis und recht fragwürdigen edukatorischen Ansprüchen. Dazu gibt es mit Sicherheit Fragen. Ja.
Ja, vielen Dank für den Vortrag. Ich habe eine Begriffsfrage. Sie haben den Begriff postdigitale Infrastruktur mehrmals verwendet. Und ich würde gerne einmal nachfragen, was Sie damit genau meinen, weil mir sagt er so noch nichts.
Ja, der wurde, ist schon eine Weile her, 10 Jahre von Ross Perry meines Wissens gegründet oder geformt, erfunden, wie auch immer, der an der University of Leicester School of Museum Studies lehrt. Und der meint im Grunde, dass wir eben nicht nur die digitalen Technologien uns anschauen, sondern das als postdigital, ähnlich wie postkolonial oder auch postfeministisch oder andere Posts sozusagen begreifen, dass wir digitale oder dass das Digitale tatsächlich in den Alltag, in unsere Nutzung hineinreicht. Also dass man nicht mehr fein sauberlich natürlich nicht trennen kann zwischen digital und analog, sondern dass das verschränkt ist und dass digitale Logiken auf unser gesamtes Nutzungsverhalten, auf unseren Alltag, auch auf Wissenschaft wahrscheinlich, oder ja, merken wir ja gerade verstärkt, Auswirkungen hat und wir uns deswegen oder so schlägt er vor, in diesen postdigitalen Räumen tatsächlich bewegen. Also wie die Logiken, die durch digitale Techniken entstehen und wie sich das eben auch verändert. Das steckt so in diesem Post, also das ist damit gemeint, dass man nicht unbedingt von digitalen Technologien spricht und die technische Seite, meinetwegen auch die wirtschaftliche Seite betrachtet, sondern dass das wirklich dieses nachdem, also so interpretiere ich das Post eben modal und nicht temporal, das verändert, wie wir sprechen, wie wir denken, wie wir wahrnehmen, wie wir nutzen, wie wir interpretieren. Und ich denke, dass wir alle wissen, dass es da auch generationelle Unterschiede gibt. Ich selber bin analog sozialisiert natürlich. Und da kann man ja Unterschiede feststellen zwischen Generationen, wie mit digitalen Techniken eben umgegangen wird, wie das eben auch prägt. Es gibt auch wissenschaftliche Studien dazu natürlich, wie in jungen Jahren das Gehirn sich auch anders sozusagen formt durch die Nutzung digitaler Technologie und so weiter. Also was damit gemeint ist, ist, dass tatsächlich, dass da kulturelle und auch soziale Implikationen drin sind und deswegen man eher von Post, oder wenn man das betonen möchte, eher von postdigital statt von digital dann spricht.
Ja, vielen Dank. Mhm.
Ja, vielen Dank für den Vortrag. Es war ein super Überblick über das Thema. Mich würde interessieren, Sie haben jetzt die empirische Rezeptionsforschung im Prinzip stark gemacht, die notwendig wäre. Ich habe mich gefragt, wie wir als Museumswissenschaftlerinnen da ran sollen, weil für mich klingt es so, als bräuchten wir auch hier weitere Expertise aus der Psychologie möglicherweise, ja, weil es ist ja, ich sage den Studierenden immer, machen Sie bloß keine Rezeptionsforschung oder Wirkungsforschung, weil wir wissen ja nicht, was vorher war, ja, wir müssen im Prinzip müssen abrufen, mit welcher Einstellung, Vorerfahrungen, Vorkenntnissen sind Leute da rein und wie kommen sie raus? Das sehe ich immer irgendwie schwierig und versuche die Studierenden davon abzuhalten, weil das als studentisches Projekt kaum zu machen ist. Also da würde mich einfach Ihre Einschätzung interessieren. Müssen wir dann nicht viel mehr interdisziplinärer denken und vielleicht auch neue Ansätze und neue Kooperationen mit anderen Fächern suchen?
Ja, vielen Dank. Würde ich absolut genauso sehen. Und es wird natürlich auch nicht einfacher, sondern es wird eben noch komplexer, wenn wir über umstrittenes Kulturerbe sprechen. Ich hatte das erwähnt, dass aus meiner Sicht auch Emotionen, Werte, ideologische oder politische Einstellungen quer durch das Spektrum einbezogen werden müssen in empirische Forschung, weil man sonst wirklich wesentliche Motivationen zum Beispiel übersieht. Ich würde auch denken, dass das nicht disziplinär zu machen ist und auch Visited Studies oder eben in Rezeptionsforschung, Besucherinnenforschung per se interdisziplinär zu verstehen ist. Ich habe das hier nur relativ betont, weil in Deutschland dieser ganze Bereich nicht wirklich etabliert ist. Also und ich war eben in England vorher, da ist das deutlich, da wird es ja drauf seit Jahren, es war eben auch Forderung aus Kulturpolitik rauf und runter gemacht. Aber auch da würde ich sagen, dass noch mehr, also die arbeiten auch interdisziplinär natürlich, aber dass das auf jeden Fall nötig ist. Und ich würde auch denken, dass das auf studentischer, sagen wir bis Masterebene, wahrscheinlich auch sogar bis Doktoratsebene, sehr schwierig ist zu machen, weil das tatsächlich so, also da gescheite Methodiken zu entwickeln, da haben Sie, das würde ich so sehen wie Sie. Ja, auf jeden Fall. Ich würde trotzdem denken, dass es nötig ist und dass es hilfreich wäre, gerade in den Zeiten, in denen wir uns gerade befinden. Also man kann ja wirklich feststellen, dass gerade Kulturerbe, aber auch Museen als öffentliche Einrichtungen oder zivilgesellschaftliche Einrichtungen, besonders wenn sie öffentlich finanziert werden, dass sie massiv unter Druck geraten. Und das klingt mir eigentlich immer zu passiv, sondern es ist ja wirklich ein ins Visier genommen werden, von dem wir ausgehen können, dass es stärker oder zunehmen wird. Wo ich denken würde, dass der Sektor relativ schlecht darauf vorbereitet ist, weil, also das ist jetzt kein Vorwurf, sondern nur eine Feststellung, dass wir in der Hinsicht mehr tun müssen und mehr machen müssen. Und ich würde da schon denken, dass wir das empirisch fundieren sollten. Nicht nur, aber auch.
Ja, unbedingt. Vielleicht darf ich noch eine Nachfrage stellen. Mich würde interessieren, haben Sie noch Hoffnung fürs Pergamon-Museum? Ich meine, jetzt ist es ja geschlossen, sage ich jetzt mal, ja, und man darf ja gespannt sein, in 10 Jahren, wann auch immer es öffnet, ob sich aus Ihrer Sicht da vielleicht was tun kann.
Ja, Hoffnung sollte man immer haben, würde ich denken. Grundsätzlich bin ich immer optimistisch. Man müsste wahrscheinlich sehen, wie man in der Hinsicht Druck aufbauen kann. Und das ist dann wirklich unser aller Arbeit sozusagen, das zu machen, uns da vielleicht auch stärker zu vernetzen und das deutlicher zu machen. Vielleicht sich auch weiß ich nicht, manchmal muss man sich eben, je nachdem, in welchem Kontext man das sowas anspricht, vielleicht auch dann trauen, das zu tun, weil es ja dann schon die staatlichen Museen natürlich sind. Und das wissen die natürlich auch, oder so verstehen die sich auch selber. Ich habe einige Videos oder Projektionen gesehen, die waren noch in der alten Ausstellung, bevor jetzt der sogenannte vorderasiatische Bereich geschlossen wurde, also wo projiziert wurde. Das war ein Werbevideo, wenn man so will. Da hatte ich nicht den Eindruck, dass sich etwas zumindest nicht in kritischer Hinsicht ändert. Im Gegenteil, es wird halt tatsächlich ins 21. Jahrhundert geholt. Es sieht alles glänzender, teurer, wenn man so will, ein bisschen blöd gesagt, aber in der Hinsicht aus. Aber dass da größere kritische Ansätze habe ich da nicht erkennen können. Insofern, das ist jetzt auch nicht pessimistisch gedacht. Wir müssen halt dann weiter dran arbeiten. Aber aus den Museen heraus, jetzt erstmal sehe ich das so nicht, muss ich sagen. Ich würde denken, dass das Museum für Islamische Kunst, das würde ich für interessanter in dieser Hinsicht halten. Der Museumsdirektor ist sehr aktiv, sehr auch mit Community-Arbeit beschäftigt. Und das Museum für Islamische Kunst hat ja ähnlich schwierige oder umstrittene, wie auch immer, Geschichte wie die anderen staatlichen Museen auch. Aber was ich eben gesehen habe von diesen Werbevideos, da würde ich jetzt nicht drauf setzen, dass da was kommt. Also da müssten wir uns vielleicht auch aus Hochschulebene, aus Hochschulseite oder vernetzt mit AktivistInnen, Grassroots, wie auch immer, wen man identifizieren möchte, mit wem man kooperieren möchte, möglicherweise Druck aufbauen, wie das zum Beispiel im Humboldt-Forum ja funktioniert. Oder sagen wir, ich weiß nicht, ob es funktioniert, das ist dann zu diskutieren, aber wie es existiert, so, also wie diese Szene, diese Community existiert ja, da wird ja einiges gemacht. Das müsste man meines Erachtens auch mit Bezug auf die Museumsinsel, jetzt nicht nur das Pergamon, sondern die gesamte Insel machen.
Ja, vielen
Und
Dank.
natürlich auch über Berlin hinaus. Entschuldigung, ich habe jetzt so natürlich nur die Museumsinsel. Das gilt nicht nur für die Museumsinsel, ist ja klar.
Wir haben auch Fragen aus dem Chat. Vielleicht wollen Sie mal eine, ich weiß nicht,
ja.
viele, was vorlesen?
Eine, die sich, glaube ich, sehr gut anschließt. Und zwar kam die Frage, wurden die erarbeiteten Interventionen und neuen perspektivischen Anregungen der Studierenden an das Museum herangetragen? Wenn ja, mit welchen Auswirkungen?
Das ist ein sehr guter Punkt. Nein, wurden sie nicht. Also das ist aber eine gute Idee. Ich hatte das mal eine Weile erwogen, obwohl ich bin dann auch, nee, wann war ich denn da? Ich glaube, dann kam die Pandemie tatsächlich und danach, also am Ende der Pandemie bin ich weg aus Berlin. Aber an sich ist das natürlich, es ist eine sehr gute Idee, dass man das macht. Inzwischen sind auch ein paar Jahre vergangen und mein Eindruck ist insgesamt, die Museumsszene in Deutschland, gerade nach der Pandemie, ist deutlich dynamischer geworden. Da sind deutlich auch in den Verbänden, Deutscher Museumsbund, ICOM und so weiter, haben Debatten stattgefunden, die also wirklich eine Dynamik erkennen lassen. Von daher ist das eine super Idee, vielen Dank. Das sollte ich überlegen. Haus Bastian, im Bode-Museum gibt es auch Ansätze, da sind jüngere KuratorInnen, die nachkommen und was dann vielleicht doch auch von innen bewegen können. Das sollte ich vielleicht aufgreifen oder schauen, wie man es tatsächlich kommuniziert. Ich habe andere BesucherInnen oder kleine Forschungsstudien gemacht, auch mit Studierenden das war im Neuen Museum und da haben wir uns getroffen mit einigen Personen von den Museen und auch von der Vermittlung und unsere Ergebnisse präsentiert. Das hat aber auch doch eine Sache, die wir sozusagen, über die wir wirklich gestolpert waren, im Neuen Museum war das, die ist dann tatsächlich geändert worden. Das war aber auch eine sehr, sehr problematische Darstellung. Aber das wäre, das nehme ich gerne mit. Also vielen Dank für den Hinweis, dass ich es jetzt einfach nach ein paar Jahren nochmal aufnehme und nochmal vielleicht eine Neuauflage davon mache. Das Panorama steht ja noch und wie Sie eben so schön sagten, in den weiteren 10 Jahren, also so schnell öffnet das Pergamon-Museum. Ich habe jetzt gerade gar nicht das offizielle Jahr oder die offizielle Planung im Kopf, aber es ist ja schon mehrfach verschoben worden auch. Auch jetzt keine Kritik, ist einfach eine Wahnsinnsaufgabe, das sehe ich schon, aber dass man das jetzt nochmal aufnimmt und nochmal neu mit Studierenden hinfährt und was macht und dann vielleicht das Museum einbezieht oder mit denen spricht. Ja, gute Idee. Danke.
Ja, vielen Dank. Noch eine Frage.
Ich hätte noch eine Frage und will ein bisschen an das von Stefanie Samidau anschließen, weil ich finde, Sie haben das ja sehr schön gezeigt, wie quasi das formale Gestaltung, die Technik, quasi das Inhaltliche dominiert, dann letztendlich in der Aussage und so ein koloniales Narrativ irgendwie auch weiterspinnt oder die Stereotype reproduziert. Inwieweit, oder wissen Sie das, gab es da eine Zusammenarbeit mit Assisi? Weil ich weiß ja, wenn man die forschen ja auch nach, was es dann gibt. Und also wurde das unabhängig voneinander produziert oder standen die in Austausch? Beides kann ja dann in jedem Fall problematisch sein, aber das würde mich so ein bisschen interessieren, ob Sie da was rausfinden konnten, wie das quasi hergestellt, produziert wurde.
Wirklich interessante Frage, genau. Und beides wäre, je nachdem, wie die Antwort dann ist. Ich habe da selber mit niemandem, also nicht drüber gesprochen. Das würde noch ausstehen. Das müsste ich noch machen, tatsächlich. Aber die sind da relativ offen gewesen in den Broschüren oder auch Zeitungen, die staatlichen Museen zum Teil veröffentlichen und darüber schreiben, also im Werbematerial, wenn Sie so wollen, zu dieser Ausstellung. Also war eine enge Zusammenarbeit und es wird auch betont, dass die natürlich einerseits, also dass sie fiktiv sind, die Szenen, das ist ja klar, das geht ja nicht anders, die von Assisi da kreiert wurden. Aber dass das basiert auf dem aktuellen Stand der Forschung, das schon. Ich fand nur, und das nehme ich auch an, also dass sie dann natürlich eng zusammengearbeitet haben. Die Ausstellung selber ist das Panorama, die anderen Räume, auch diese dramatische, diese goldfarbenen und blauen Inszenierung, die ich anfangs gezeigt hatte, das ist halt von Museumsseite. Auch dass diese Projektion, also diese Animation, diese zweite, die ich gezeigt hatte, die ist nicht von Azizi, die ist von einem Architekturbüro Architekturbüro, die mit digitalen Rekonstruktionen arbeiten, im Auftrag des Museums erstellt worden. Und Azizi ist natürlich auch, arbeitet ja auch im Auftrag des Museums. Auf der einen Seite, auf der anderen Seite habe ich das noch nie in so einer Ausstellung gesehen, dass Azizi, also der Künstler in dem Fall, sehr stark Werbung für sich und sein Werk machen konnte. Also es ist jetzt keine Retrospektive in irgendeiner Weise von Azizi gewesen, sondern es war ja auch sozusagen eine Auftragsarbeit, was ja völlig okay ist. Aber Azizi, ich weiß nicht, ob Sie den kennen oder schon mal was anderes von ihm gesehen haben. In Berlin selber ist ja zur Mauer ein Panorama auch von ihm erstellt worden, aber er hat auch weiß nicht, diese Panoramen über den Amazonas, über, was war noch? Also sehr breit gefächerte Themen, die er bedient hat. Eins auch Dresden 45, erinnere ich mich. Da möchte ich, glaube ich, nicht wissen, wie das aussieht, wenn ich mir jetzt angucke, wie der Pergamonaltar hier inszeniert wurde. Also sehr seltsam fand ich das. Und ich habe das in der Ausstellung so auch noch nicht gesehen, dass da der Künstler selber sein eigenes Werk sozusagen bewerben kann und sehr kommerziell, wenn man so will. Das fand ich eine Besonderheit in dem Fall, aber es ist ganz klar, dass das wissenschaftlich basiert war und das Museum natürlich verantwortlich ist, weil das auch, also im Zusammenhang mit dem Panorama, mit dem Pergamon-Museum entstanden ist. Von daher kann man das Museum da nicht aus der Verantwortung nehmen und deswegen hat mich das gewundert, dass also der Pergamon-Altar, von dem ja wirklich nicht historisch nicht restlos geklärt ist, wofür der eigentlich, also welche Funktion der hatten, aber da war das hier so sehr stark, also die Opfertiere, das Blut, was wirklich die Treppen, also die sind ja wirklich unter der Vorplatz da rot getränkt, sehr gut zu sehen, auch relativ niedrig, also man muss nicht ganz nach oben auf den Turm klettern, um das sehen zu können, sondern man kann unten stehen bleiben, also sehr, man kann es quasi nicht sehen. Also sehr zentral. Das hat mich schon sehr gewundert. Und da würde ich dann eben schon denken, dass man das auch mitbedenken muss. Das sind halt kuratorische Entscheidungen, die offensichtlich von so einer Dramaturgie des Immersiven eben, möglicherweise der Überwältigung dieser vermeintlichen Lebensechtheit und einfach dramaturgisiert wurden. Ich glaube, Elisa Bernhardt, I followed your talk and you talked about this dramatizing effects as well. So I found that very interesting. That I see a lot of overlap with the Pergamon. Also, also das finde ich interessant, hat mich aber auch ein bisschen verwundert. Also, dass das Museum das dann hat machen lassen. Und interessanterweise nimmt der Museumsdirektor auch vorweg in einer der Interviews da in diesen Zeitungen, die ich da eben erwähnt habe, oder Zeitschriften, dass er sich bewusst ist, dass das da wahrscheinlich umstritten ist, dass das gerade in Fachkreisen nicht unbedingt akzeptiert wird oder dass da Kritik kommen wird. Ja, das verstehe ich, dass man auch solche Entscheidungen treffen muss. Und wenn man neue Zielgruppen ansprechen möchte, dann verstehe ich auch, dass man neue Wege gehen muss und dass man da Risiken eingehen muss und die auch vielleicht nicht immer von den verschiedenen Disziplinen an Universitäten tatsächlich unterstützt werden. Und gerade vor diesem Hintergrund fand ich dann eben auch spannend oder interessant und auch verwunderlich zu sehen, wie die Studierenden darauf reagiert haben. Also, dass ich mehrfach wirklich nachdrücklich darauf hinweisen musste, dass einige problematische Narrative und Truppen halt vorkommen, dass aber einige trotzdem insistierten, dass sie es dennoch toll fanden. Also ein bisschen platt gesagt jetzt aber. Also das sind schon so Zwänge sozusagen oder wie habe ich es genannt, nicht nur digitale Affordanzen, glaube ich, oder Affordances im Englischen, also die Möglichkeiten, die man hat, sondern eben auch die kuratorischen, die baulichen von Architektur. Das alte Pergamon-Museum gibt eben auch gewisse bauliche Beschränkungen vor. Das sind halt alles schon sehr komplexe Kontexte, ich kann das verstehen, aber ich finde, das sollte man thematisieren und nicht wie hier übergehen und dann versuchen mit Technologien, in diesem Fall digitalen Technologien, im Grunde ein verfeinertes Modell der Rekonstruktion in einem Pergamon-Museum zu präsentieren.
Ja, also ganz vielen Dank. Ich denke, das ist sicherlich ein Vortrag, der noch viel, viel mehr Fragen aufwirft, aber an Betracht der Zeit, leider, wir sind schon doch ziemlich drüber, würde ich jetzt unsere Sektion hier beschließen. Also nochmal ganz herzlichen Dank für Ihren Vortrag und wir setzen dann morgen um 9:30 Uhr fort. Herzlichen Dank auch an alle Zuhörer und wirklich die spannenden Fragen und Diskussionen. Dankeschön.